There is a silence that follows every roar. It is the sound of a stadium after the final whistle. When the crowd's thunder drains into memory and the air feels heavy, almost suspiciously calm. In the 1950s, that silence was sacred to some and terrifying to others. Because when the crowds went home and the reporters closed their notebooks, another game began. It was a quieter one, played in hotel rooms and back alleys, in smoke-filled bars where the future of football could change with the passing of an envelope. I remember the grainy footage of those years, the colors washed out, the faces hard, the grass too bright under the afternoon sun. Players walked off fields covered in mud, faces expressionless, as if they carried something heavier than exhaustion. The game looked simple then: a man, a ball, and the will to win. But beneath that image was a system that had already learned to hide its secrets. It was a time when the league was still fighting to prove itself legitimate, while powerful men outside the lines had already decided it was their next investment. The NFL of the 1950s was not the global empire it would become. Teams struggled for attendance, salaries were small, and fame came without fortune. Players sold insurance in the off-season, worked factory shifts, or managed bars to feed their families. A championship bonus might barely cover a mortgage payment. That kind of desperation created opportunity. And the mob knew opportunity when it saw it. They did not need to threaten anyone. All they had to do was offer. A loan here, a gift there. A small favor that grew into something larger. It started as whispers around locker rooms and ended as a shadow stretching across the entire league. The public believed football was pure, untouched by the corruption that had already shaken baseball and college sports. But the truth is, purity is expensive, and purity without money rarely lasts. The mob understood that the best way to control a game was not by buying it outright, but by owning the people who played it. They watched the sport grow, quietly investing in betting syndicates that turned every Sunday into an underground economy. Back then, there were no official odds printed in papers, no regulated sportsbooks, no oversight committees. The spread existed on scraps of paper passed through hands that knew better than to talk. Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia had their own networks. Every week, gamblers placed bets worth more than any player's annual salary. Those who handled the numbers kept their faces clean, but behind them were men with names whispered in fear. Luciano, Accardo, Costello. They did not need to step onto the field. Their influence traveled by phone calls, by coded notes, by favors exchanged in the quiet. It is easy to imagine the mob as distant villains, but in truth, they were woven into the everyday rhythm of the sport. A team owner might share a dinner table with a bookmaker. A coach might owe a debt to someone he met in his youth. A player might have a cousin who knew a man who could make things right after a bad loss. It was a culture of small compromises that added up to something larger, something unseen but deeply felt. The newspapers did not print those stories. The league wanted no part of them. The NFL in the 1950s was obsessed with image, trying to convince America that it was as wholesome as the family watching from their living room. Television had just arrived, and the league needed clean heroes. But the cameras could not see everything. They could not capture the nervous glances before a game, the rumors that spread through press boxes, or the quiet questions about how a fumble happened at just the right moment. Behind closed doors, the league was terrified. Not of losing games, but of losing credibility. Baseball had been humiliated by the Black Sox scandal a generation earlier, and the NFL's leaders knew a single exposed fix could destroy everything they had built. Commissioner Bert Bell often warned that gambling was the greatest threat to the sport's survival. His words were not exaggeration. He understood that money has a way of rewriting rules, and the mob had more money than the league itself. There were stories that surfaced and then disappeared. A player approached by a stranger offering a cash incentive. A coach who found anonymous notes slipped under his hotel door. Referees who claimed they heard things in locker rooms that no one wanted to repeat. Nothing proven, nothing public, but enough to leave a chill over the league's confidence. It was a decade of secrets guarded with fear, because exposure meant collapse. The bettors didn't care who won. They cared only that the spread was right. That meant controlling outcomes by inches, not miles. A missed field goal here, a dropped pass there, a decision to go for it on fourth down that seemed bold but suspiciously aligned with the numbers. And because the league was still small, a single game could swing fortunes. Some teams traveled by train with less security than a small-town bank, carrying cash payouts and ticket stubs worth thousands on the black market. In cities like Chicago, the connection between football and organized crime was barely concealed. Bars where players drank were often owned by men who also ran numbers rackets. A local bookmaker might show up to practice, pretending to be a fan. Everyone knew what he was. No one said anything. Silence was a kind of currency. If you kept quiet, you kept safe. If you talked, you disappeared from the sport. For the players, the pressure was immense. They were local heroes who lived modest lives. Some drove used cars and rented apartments, while gamblers in the same city drove Cadillacs and owned restaurants. It was a tempting world that promised security in exchange for small cooperation. And in a decade where most contracts could be voided without explanation, loyalty to the league was often more dangerous than loyalty to a friend with connections. The mob did not have to control the league. They only had to be close enough to touch it. Every time the league announced a new anti-gambling policy, the betting lines grew longer. Every time a commissioner made a speech about integrity, new money flowed underground. It was a game within a game, a parallel league of shadows that thrived on the sport's own success. Fans had no idea. To them, football was an escape from the gray world of post-war America. The Sunday ritual was sacred, and the NFL was a symbol of fairness, toughness, and honesty. But truth has a way of echoing through time. Old players spoke years later about moments that felt wrong, plays that did not add up, teammates who changed under pressure. They never named names, but the tone said enough. Something had been watching them, shaping them, testing them. By the late 1950s, as television money began to grow, the league finally started to realize how close it had come to collapse. The rise of Las Vegas was still a few years away, but the mob had already learned everything it needed from the NFL. How to control emotion, how to manipulate odds, how to make the unpredictable predictable. Football was the perfect laboratory for greed, and the league's innocence was its greatest weakness. The public would never know how many games were influenced or how many players were compromised. What mattered was that it could have happened, and that fear alone haunted every locker room, every office, every handshake between owners and outsiders. The league was building an empire, but it was also building a myth that it was too strong, too clean, too honest to be touched. In reality, the 1950s NFL was standing on a fault line, one that could crack under the weight of even a single exposed scandal. The mob was patient. It had no need to destroy what it could quietly profit from, so it waited, shaping the culture from within, waiting for its next opportunity. And as I look back on that decade, the truth feels colder than ever. The league wasn't just fighting losing seasons. It was fighting ghosts in the bleachers. Under the bright optimism of post-war America, the 1950s promised renewal. The soldiers had come home, factories roared again, and the suburbs spread across the map like freshly painted hope. The nation was watching itself rebuild in real time, and for the first time, television captured the story. Families gathered in living rooms where static screens turned into glowing windows, showing everything from politics to game shows to football. The National Football League, once a modest patchwork of small-town teams and uncertain attendance, suddenly looked like part of the American dream. Yet behind the cheers and the national pride, the 1950s also became a decade where organized crime quietly matured. The same roads that carried prosperity also carried envelopes of cash. And the same neighborhoods that built churches built casinos in the back rooms of taverns. Before Las Vegas became a monument to legalized temptation, gambling in America was already a living system, fed by underground networks of bookmakers, syndicates, and local fixers. It did not need neon to exist. It thrived in whispers, phone calls, and debts recorded in coded ledgers. Sports were its most reliable stage. Baseball, boxing, college basketball law had already tasted scandal before the decade began. In smoky rooms and crowded bars, men discussed point spreads with the same passion fans reserved for touchdowns. And as the NFL began to grow, these men took notice. The league's small salaries and expanding popularity made it fertile ground for influence. The early 1950s were defined by the shadow of exposure. In Washington, the Kefauver Hearings began in 1950, broadcasting across the nation. Senator Estes Kefauver led an investigation into organized crime that peeled back layers of an underworld few Americans had ever seen. Millions watched mob bosses, fixers, and frontmen testify under oath, their faces pale under the lights of live television. The hearings were not about football specifically, but their reach was universal. They showed how deep the mob had spread into politics, unions, and entertainment, by implication, how easily it could reach into sports. The message was clear. If there was money in a game, the mob was already there. In college sports, scandals exploded first. In 1951, New York authorities uncovered a point-shaving operation that linked several major college basketball programs, including the City College of New York. Athletes were caught taking bribes to manipulate scores without losing outright, preserving the illusion of fair play. The revelations stunned the nation. Newspapers spoke of betrayal, of corruption in what had been considered innocent games. For the NFL, it was a warning flare. If college players could be bought, what about professionals earning barely enough to live on? The league's leadership understood the stakes. Bert Bell, who served as NFL commissioner from 1946 until his death in 1959, was not blind to the problem. A former coach and owner, Bell had seen firsthand how close the sports margins were financially and morally. He introduced strict anti-gambling rules, banned players from associating with known gamblers, and publicly condemned point shaving. But in truth, Bell's policies worked more like fences than walls. They could keep the honest men inside, but never fully shut out the world beyond. The mob did not announce its presence. It did not need to. Its currency was trust, and its method was patience. Even as the league projected an image of clean competition, rumors circulated through locker rooms and press boxes. There were stories of players who suddenly underperformed in meaningless games, of referees whose calls tilted too conveniently, of betting lines that shifted before kickoff without explanation. Nothing ever proven, nothing ever directly traced, but in a sport as intimate as the early NFL, such whispers traveled fast. Reporters caught fragments, coaches suspected betrayals, and team owners quietly wondered how much of their sport they truly controlled. Television, the very tool that lifted football into the mainstream, also amplified the stakes. Every broadcast game became an opportunity not only for fans, but for gamblers. Point spreads were discussed in bars and living rooms alongside pre-game predictions. For the mob, visibility was power. The more the public cared, the more money flowed. And the more money flowed, the greater the incentive to influence outcomes, even subtly. What made the 1950s uniquely vulnerable was the league's structure itself. Players had limited rights, little leverage, and smaller paychecks compared to modern standards. A star player might earn a few $1,000s a year, while a bookmaker could offer that in a single envelope. The temptation was not always greed, was survival. The culture of silence ensured that if something happened, it stayed between those who benefited and those too afraid to speak. Meanwhile, organized crime adapted its methods. The days of overt threats and public violence were fading. The mob of the 1950s preferred quiet partnerships, friendly favors, and plausible deniability. Fixers would not meet athletes directly. They used intermediaries, friends, relatives, old teammates who could make an offer sound like opportunity instead of coercion. Many players likely never realized the full scale of the network surrounding them. They saw it as easy money, not a chain of obligation. For the NFL, the challenge was perception. The league had spent decades fighting for legitimacy, overshadowed by college football and baseball. Any hint of scandal could undo that progress. Bert Bell knew that a single confirmed fix could collapse the league's credibility. So he acted with caution, enforcing discipline quietly and investigating leads privately. When suspicions arose, players were questioned behind closed doors and files were sealed. To the public, the NFL remained spotless. Behind the curtain, however, there was constant anxiety of fear that the next headline could destroy everything. By the middle of the decade, the league's image was inseparable from the American ideal. Families watched Sunday games together. Corporate sponsors saw opportunity. Stadiums expanded, and franchises moved into new cities. Yet the mob remained in proximity, no longer in the bleachers, but in the betting parlors and phone banks that tracked every down and yard. The league's growing popularity made it impossible to avoid the gambling economy entirely. Each game represented millions in wagers across the country. The NFL did not need to cooperate for the mob to profit. It only needed to exist. The Kefauver Hearings had exposed how deeply crime families had penetrated legitimate enterprises. Politicians spoke of reform, but the reality was that gambling was woven into the national fabric. Bookmakers were neighbors, not villains, in cities like Chicago, New York, and Cleveland. The same men who controlled union votes and nightclub contracts also handled the odds on Sunday. The NFL's leadership could condemn gambling publicly, but privately, they understood it was the other half of their audience. Fans who bet watched every minute. Fans who did not could walk away. This tension defined the decade. The NFL wanted moral purity in an age of temptation. It wanted to be America's pastime, while America flirted with vice. Every clean tackle on the field carried the weight of unseen transactions off it. Some historians later argued that the sport's integrity survived by chance rather than policy, that the mob found easier profits elsewhere before fully corrupting professional football. Others believed the league's vigilance and secrecy saved it from collapse. Both views contain some truth. By 1959, as Bert Bell's tenure came to an end, the NFL had managed to cross from regional curiosity to national institution. But it did so under constant watch both from the media and from the quiet men who never appeared in photographs. The game's image of fair competition was protected with the intensity of a national secret. Few fans suspected that the purity of Sunday football was maintained not by innocence, but by fear of exposure, fear of collapse, and fear of the unseen hands that might still be keeping score. The 1950s NFL was not just a sports league. It was a balancing act between virtue and vice, hope and control. The league's golden decade was also its most fragile. A time when every victory felt shadowed by the possibility that someone else had already decided the outcome. The mob never needed to own a team to influence the game. It only needed to remind the world that everything with a price could be bought, even belief. The story of gambling before Vegas is not about a city of lights, but about a culture of secrecy that shaped how Americans learned to love their games. The NFL's strength grew in proportion to its silence, and in that silence, the lines between sport and scheme blurred until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. In the early years of professional football, long before television contracts and endorsement deals, the game was played on shoestring budgets and raw faith. Players earned little, often working second jobs to make ends meet. Team owners struggled to keep franchises alive. Stadiums were modest, travel was grueling, and the margins were thin. Yet outside those fragile stadium walls, another economy was thriving. Organized crime had begun to understand something that league officials were only starting to realize. Sports were not just games. They were systems of prediction, emotion, and loyalty. They could be controlled, monetized, and manipulated without ever stepping onto the field. By the 1940s and 1950s, bookmakers were already the quiet power behind the nation's weekend rituals. They operated from back rooms, barbershops, and corner taverns, blending into the daily rhythm of American life. Their ledgers were as meticulous as any accountant's, tracking odds and wagers with mathematical precision. A bookmaker did not need to understand the intricacies of a playbook. He only needed to understand human nature. Football offered the perfect balance of chaos and order, the kind of uncertainty that fueled endless speculation. The mob saw in the NFL a living, breathing marketplace where fortunes could be built on the faith of the crowd. For the players, life was simpler, but harder. A professional career rarely lasted more than a few seasons. Injuries were constant, medical care was minimal, and contracts offered little security. During the off-season, many worked as factory hands, salesmen, or laborers. The contrast between the glamour of the game and the reality of their paychecks left many vulnerable. They were public figures without financial safety, heroes on Sunday and ordinary men on Monday. The mob understood that kind of vulnerability. It was fertile ground for quiet partnerships. The first connections were not dramatic. There were no secret meetings in dark alleys, no overt threats. They began with conversations friendly, familiar, almost harmless. A local bookmaker might strike up a friendship with a player, buy him dinner, share stories about the game. Over time, those conversations turned into opportunities. Sometimes it was a small wager placed on a game the player was not even involved in. Other times, it was an advance of cash during a difficult stretch, an off-season loan with no written terms. The repayment, unspoken but understood, could come later, perhaps in the form of a favor or a quiet word about an injury. In those years, the NFL was still small enough that everyone knew someone. Bookmakers rarely needed to approach players directly. A brother-in-law, a teammate, or a local contact could bridge the gap. A few $100s passed quietly could make a difference to a man supporting a family. The player might tell himself it was nothing serious, just a gesture, a bit of harmless help. But to the men behind the money, it was the start of leverage. The mob operated on relationships, not contracts. Trust was currency, and favors were collateral. These early partnerships were sustained by the illusion of friendship. Players did not always realize they had stepped into an arrangement that could not be easily escaped. Once a man took the money, even innocently, he carried a silent debt. That debt did not always demand repayment in action. Often, it was enough for him to know that someone else now had a claim on him. As the 1950s unfolded, this system matured into a web of informal deals. Bookmakers developed networks within cities that mirrored the league's structure. Chicago, New York, Cleveland, and Philadelphia each had their own circles of influence. A bookmaker might know which players were struggling financially or drinking too much, who gambled themselves, and who needed help with rent or medical bills. The information alone was valuable. It gave the mob insight into the psychology of the teams, the emotional state of the players, and the unpredictability of the game. For the players, these connections often blurred the lines between survival and compromise. Many of them saw no harm in accepting help when the league offered none. The NFL was not yet a wealthy institution. Salaries lagged behind baseball, and the promise of television revenue had only just begun to surface. A single injury could end a career overnight. To borrow a few $100s from a local bookmaker felt like necessity, not betrayal. And yet each decision quietly expanded the mob's reach. There were cases where those informal debts turned into subtle pressure. A bookmaker might ask a player to share inside information whether a quarterback's shoulder was still injured, whether a coach planned to rest a key player. To the player, it might seem harmless. He was not changing the outcome of a game, just confirming a rumor. But to those who controlled the betting lines, such details were priceless. It allowed them to shape odds, anticipate outcomes, and manage risks. It gave them control without exposure. The relationship was symbiotic, but never equal. Players believed they were trading information for friendship. The mob knew it was building a structure of influence. Every conversation, every favor, every handshake was a thread in that design. By the mid-1950s, the NFL had become part of a larger ecosystem of sports gambling that spans states and cities. Even if a player never took a bribe, he was surrounded by a culture that normalized the presence of gambling in the background of every game. Inside locker rooms, talk of point spreads was casual. Players knew what the odds were. Some even joked about them. It was part of the atmosphere, part of the tension that hung over every matchup. Coaches tried to ignore it. Owners pretended it did not exist, and the league office issued stern warnings. But the truth was that the NFL depended on public engagement, and gambling kept people engaged. It made every game meaningful to those who bet their wages on it. The league's silence became a kind of complicity. The mob's power lay in invisibility. It never needed to own a team or threaten a player outright. Its influence worked through perception and fear. If a player believed that someone was watching his performance, he might play differently. If a coach suspected that his players were compromised, his strategy might shift. The uncertainty itself became a weapon. The mob profited not only from games, but from the paranoia surrounding them. Behind the scenes, the league was aware of the risks. Commissioner Bert Bell, known for his strict stance on gambling, maintained private files on suspected cases of misconduct. He warned players that association with gamblers could end their careers, but enforcement was difficult. The boundaries between friendship and criminal association were often impossible to define. Many of the accused were never proven guilty of wrongdoing, yet their reputations suffered. Bell's challenge was that he was fighting an enemy without a face, a network of relationships that operated entirely in whispers. The emotional toll on players was profound. Many felt trapped between loyalty to their teams and fear of financial ruin. They were not criminals, but they lived in a world where integrity was constantly tested. Some rationalized their choices as survival. Others carried the guilt in silence. The pressure of expectation from fans and the insecurity of life off the field created a moral gray zone that the mob exploited with precision. To understand the silent partnership between the NFL and organized crime during this era is to understand desperation dressed as opportunity. The league's heroes were not wealthy men. They were workers in uniforms, struggling to hold their place in a sport that offered glory but little security. The mob, in turn, offered stability of a darker, kind, quick money, protection, and the illusion of friendship. It was a trade that asked for nothing at first, then everything. The partnership remained unspoken because it had to. Both sides depended on secrecy. The mob thrived on the league's silence, and the league's survival depended on keeping the mob invisible. It was a fragile balance that could not last forever. The cracks were already forming in the background, waiting for the moment when exposure would become inevitable. The story of those early relationships is not just about crime. It is about need, power, and the vulnerability of ambition. The NFL grew because it learned to protect its image, but that image was built over a foundation of quiet compromises. Every game played under the lights was shadowed by the possibility that unseen forces were shaping what the fans believed was pure chance. In the quiet spaces of that decade, men with ledgers and men with helmets shared the same hope to survive another season. One built empires in smoke-filled rooms, the other chased dreams on muddy fields. Both understood that everything had a price. By the mid-1950s, the game had grown louder, faster, and more watched than ever before. Crowds filled the stands, radios carried every play across the nation, and the league began to taste the first sweetness of national attention. But beneath that rise in popularity, there were shadows forming on the sideline. They were not part of any roster or coaching staff. Yet they seemed to know more about the players than the men wearing headsets. These were the gamblers, fixers, and brokers of influence who moved quietly among the league's edges. They did not wear uniforms, but they understood the game in ways few fans ever would. Their presence was never announced. They were seen in hotel bars after games, near locker room corridors, or seated just beyond the team sections in the stands. Some were regulars, friendly faces who knew the players by name and could recall every touchdown and turnover. But they were not there for the love of football. They were there for the numbers. The point spread ruled their world, and the men who controlled it held the real power over how the sport was perceived and profited from. The mob's interest in professional sports was not new. But by the 1950s, it had reached a new level of sophistication. Bookmaking had evolved into a structured business with connections stretching from the East Coast to the Midwest. Chicago served as a hub, feeding odds and information through a network of phone lines and messengers. In New York, the same lines ran through bars and private clubs, linking gamblers to the national betting markets. The mob did not operate through one man or one city. It operated through coordination, where information was the most valuable commodity. The fixers were the intermediaries who made the system function. They were the faces the players recognized, the voices they trusted. Some were former athletes, men who understood the language of locker rooms and could speak with easy familiarity. Others were promoters, journalists, or so-called advisors who seemed harmless at first glance. Their job was simple: to connect opportunity with need. If a player was in debt, they offered relief. If he was frustrated with management, they offered understanding. If he simply wanted someone to listen, they offered friendship. Beneath every handshake was an invisible agreement. It was not always about fixing games. Most of the time, the mob wanted predictability. They needed information to balance their books and manage their risk. A whispered update about a quarterback's injury, a clue about a team's morale, or the weather forecast in Cleveland could shift betting lines across the country. For the men running those operations, accuracy meant profit. A fixer could earn his place in that system simply by knowing the right things before the rest of the world did. The league's culture made this infiltration possible. Teams were insular and secretive, but they were also poorly monitored. Players were approachable. There were no security details, no agents or media handlers protecting access. After games, players walked through the same exits as fans. They stayed in modest hotels, often in the same cities week after week. The distance between professional athletes and the public was small enough to step across with a few kind words and a shared drink. In Chicago, certain bookmakers had long-standing ties with men in sports. They did not always need to coerce anyone. Charm and consistency did most of the work. They sponsored dinners, sent holiday gifts, and built relationships that seemed genuine. Players, reporters, and even coaches would accept those gestures, rarely stopping to question the source. Over time, those connections blurred the boundaries between fan and financier. New York's operations were even more entrenched. The city was the communications center of the betting world, where phone calls relayed line movements in real time. Within minutes, odds could shift based on rumors whispered in one borough and heard in another. The mob had created a living network of speculation. The NFL's weekly schedule became their stock market, and they were the brokers. For the players, the awareness of these figures was both unsettling and unavoidable. They knew who the fixers were, even if they never spoke openly about them. The conversations were quiet, coded, built around a shared understanding. A gambler might ask how a knee was feeling, or whether a team was ready to go this week. The questions seemed innocent, but both sides knew the real meaning. A single answer could ripple through the entire betting world by nightfall. The fixers cultivated familiarity. They made the players feel valued, important, and respected. At a time when the league itself often treated players as replaceable, that kind of attention was powerful. The men who played the game were not immune to flattery. Many had grown up poor, served in the war, or struggled through minor leagues to reach the pros. To be recognized and rewarded, even subtly, meant something. That emotional vulnerability was what the fixers thrived on. It would be easy to imagine these men as villains, but the truth was more complex. They were opportunists in a world that offered opportunity to few. Some were caught between loyalty to the sport and loyalty to survival. The lines between moral and immoral blurred as the business of gambling became inseparable from the culture surrounding the game. Players who accepted a dinner or a small loan might tell themselves it meant nothing. But those gestures, multiplied across teams and seasons, created an atmosphere of quiet dependency. The mob's strength came from patience. They did not need to own outcomes to profit. They needed only to shape perception, to make others believe they had influence even when they did not. Fear was as profitable as fact. The idea that a game could be fixed was often more valuable than actually fixing one. Every time a player dropped a pass or a kicker missed a field goal, someone in the crowd would wonder if the moment had been bought. That doubt, once introduced, never fully disappeared. Inside the league offices, whispers turned into files. Bert Bell kept close watch on gambling activity, issuing memos that reminded players of the dangers of association. Yet for every public warning, there were dozens of private suspicions that went unconfirmed. The NFL had no investigative arm, no network of informants, and no legal authority to challenge organized crime. It relied on fear and reputation to maintain control. But the mob's power thrived in those very conditions. To the men in charge of betting lines, the NFL was a theater of probability. Each week's games were variables in an equation they believed they could master. They used scouts, insiders, and street-level intelligence to keep their odds accurate. The spread was their art form, balancing emotion and mathematics until even chance seemed predictable. The league may have been unaware of the full extent of their influence. But the gambling syndicates saw the NFL as one of the most efficient machines for generating public obsession ever created. By the late 1950s, this silent economy had become so large that it operated almost openly. Bookmakers were no longer confined to dark rooms. They were businessmen, respected in certain circles, their operations defended by lawyers and facilitated by technology. They were part of the American system of entertainment and risk. And in every major city where the NFL played, they had contacts who could supply information faster than any sports writer could publish it. You could feel it then, something unspoken standing just beyond the chalk line. It was not a single man or a single threat. It was an atmosphere, a presence that seeped into the game itself. Players pretended not to see it. Coaches pretended not to sense it. And fans pretended not to care. But in their silence, they all acknowledged it. The league's rise to national prominence coincided with that growing shadow. The same energy that made football a national obsession made it irresistible to those who saw numbers where others saw passion. The mob understood that the crowd's faith was a resource, and that every cheer, every heartbreak, and every final score could be measured and monetized. This was the world the NFL entered as it began to transform from a struggling sport into a cultural empire. Its foundation was laid in honesty and ambition, but its surroundings were built in secrecy and calculation. The mob's influence did not always reach the field, but its shadow always did. It lingered in every uncertain call, every dropped pass, and every rumor of something not quite right. It was not proof that games were fixed, but proof that belief could be manipulated as easily as a scoreboard. The players who sensed it most were the ones who carried the burden quietly. They could feel the pressure from both sides, the loyalty to their teammates, and the pull of unseen forces. Every decision on or off the field carried a weight they could not name. And even if they never took a bribe or whispered a secret, they knew the system around them was built on whispers nonetheless. The 1950s NFL was a league on the rise and a league under watch. It was becoming the face of American resilience, yet behind that image, men with no interest in touchdowns or trophies were shaping its story for their own gain. In the winter of 1946, the National Football League found itself facing a problem that threatened its fragile sense of legitimacy. The war had just ended, Stadiums were filling again, and America was searching for entertainment that made it forget the chaos of the last decade. But beneath the renewed optimism, the league was learning that football's growing popularity had also attracted a new breed of attention. It came not from fans, not from journalists, but from men who saw the game not as sport, but as business. In smoky bars and backroom offices, they studied betting lines the way coaches studied playbooks. The gamblers had arrived, and the NFL had not yet built the defenses to keep them out. The first real alarm came quietly. 2 New York Giants players were approached by gamblers just before the championship game. The story never broke into the press, but among league officials, it spread like a whispered secret. These gamblers were not the kind of men who placed $5 bets for excitement. They operated out of the organized networks that had thrived during Prohibition. Men who had learned that power was built not through violence alone, but through influence and information. They knew that a single player, under the right pressure, could shape the outcome of a game far more efficiently than any bribe of an official or coach. What happened next became one of the NFL's first hidden scandals. The Giants' front office learned of the approach through a team insider, and within days, quiet meetings were held in hotel rooms around Manhattan. The league's commissioner at the time, Bert Bell, was informed. Bell, a man known for his strict sense of morality and obsession with the integrity of the sport, ordered that the matter be contained. There would be no police involvement, no public investigation, and no headlines. The league could not afford it. The NFL in 1946 was still fighting to be taken seriously. College football dominated the national conversation, and professional football was seen as secondary, even disreputable. Any whiff of corruption could sink years of slow progress, so the league handled it internally. The players were questioned behind closed doors. They denied taking money, denied any agreement to alter the game. The gamblers who had approached them were never publicly named, and the league's report vanished into confidential files that would remain sealed for decades. No one was punished, no fines were issued, and the public never knew a thing. The official narrative presented to fans was simple. The game had gone on as planned. But inside the league office, a new kind of fear took hold. It was not fear of losing games. It was fear of losing trust. Bert Bell knew that once the public doubted the honesty of a sport, the damage could not be undone. Baseball had already lived through its nightmare with the 1919 Black Sox scandal. Bell had studied that history well. He saw what gambling could do to the soul of a sport, how it could rot it from within long before anyone noticed the cracks. That is why the 1946 incident was treated as a warning, a moment that exposed how vulnerable the NFL still was. The league had no security protocols, no dedicated investigators, and no clear rules for how players should handle contact with gamblers. Everything relied on moral instinct and trust. Behind the scenes, Bell began laying the groundwork for change. He strengthened the league's authority over player conduct, expanded the power of the commissioner's office, and began sending private letters to team owners, reminding them of their duty to report any suspicious activity. It was an informal code, but it was the start of the NFL's obsession with secrecy. The league decided that reputation had to be protected at all costs, even if that meant hiding the truth when necessary. The players who had been approached carried the weight of that incident silently. They were not stars, but they understood what almost happened. They had seen men who moved quietly in expensive coats, offering easy money in exchange for small mistakes. A dropped pass, a missed tackle, play that seemed meaningless in the moment but shifted the point spread just enough. Those gamblers knew football intimately. They followed injury reports, player arguments, and even the weather. Every piece of information was a weapon in their business. In the years that followed, players began to notice the watchers. Men who lingered outside practice fields or who sat close to the sideline during games, always dressed too sharply for ordinary fans. Some were reporters, others were not. They smiled easily, bought drinks, asked harmless questions. But in every locker room, there was an unspoken understanding. You did not talk too much. You did not reveal who is hurt, who is angry, or who might be struggling. Any detail could reach the wrong ears. The press, in those days, never touched the subject. Sports writers depended on the league for access, and the league made sure its relationships stayed clean on the surface. The 1946 scare was buried under decades of silence, yet its impact never faded. It changed how the NFL saw itself. The innocence of the early professional era was gone. The league became more guarded, more corporate, and more cautious about what it allowed into the public eye. By the early 1950s, whispers of betting influence were everywhere. Players swapped stories about teammates being offered cash to miss a kick or fumble at the right moment. Coaches suspected strange coincidences when games turned unexpectedly. And through it all, the memory of 1946 lingered. That unspoken rule of secrecy shaped every decision. The NFL learned to operate in shadows, managing crises before they ever reached daylight. The irony was that the very thing that protected the league also made it vulnerable. By refusing to expose what had happened, the NFL created an environment where rumors flourished unchecked. No one knew how deep the problem went. Some owners believed the danger was exaggerated, a relic of the past. Others feared that organized crime had already placed its roots in the game. The truth was somewhere in between. The mob was learning, just as the league was learning, and both understood the same lesson. Information was power. When historians later looked back on the 1946 scare, they found it striking how little documentation survived. It was as if the league had intentionally erased the memory. Yet the consequences were still visible in policy, in the commissioner's stern warnings to players, in the unrelenting discipline handed out for any hint of gambling involvement. The paranoia that began that year became a defining trait of NFL leadership. In private moments, players from that era described the atmosphere as one of silent awareness. You could feel it in the locker room, in the conversations that stopped when a stranger entered, in the careful distance everyone kept from the men who lingered near the stadium gates. They were part of the crowd, but not of it. They had their own purpose, their own language of odds and numbers. The players knew enough to stay away, but curiosity was always there. Some wondered how much money really moved around their games. Others were tempted to find out. The league's survival during that period depended on restraint. Most players were veterans, men who had seen war and loss and had little interest in risking their livelihoods for quick cash. But the temptation never disappeared. It waited at the edges of the sport, patient and invisible, learning where the weaknesses were. And as the 1950s unfolded, those weaknesses would be tested again and again, until the NFL could no longer pretend it was immune. The 1946 scare was never officially recorded as a scandal, but it was the moment the league lost its innocence. It revealed that football, for all its purity and passion, was just another stage where power and greed could meet. It taught the NFL that corruption did not need to explode in headlines to exist. Sometimes it whispered in private, exchanged in a handshake, and then vanished back into the crowd. You could feel it. Something unspoken, standing just beyond the chalk line. In the years following the 1946 scare, the National Football League entered a period of uneasy growth. Crowds were larger, radio broadcasts were reaching millions, and the sport was slowly evolving into the national spectacle it would become. But as the game expanded, so did the invisible network surrounding it. Gambling had always existed at the fringes of sport, but by the early 1950s, it had become a structured industry. The men behind it were no longer individual bettors chasing luck. They were businessmen of the underground world, architects of what became known as the point spread empire. Before Las Vegas became the capital of legal gambling, the business was run out of Chicago, New York, and several hidden corners of the Midwest. The system was elaborate but efficient. At its core were the numbers runners, low-level operatives who collected bets from bars, cigar shops, and neighborhood clubs. They reported their totals to bookmakers, who in turn answered to syndicates backed by organized crime. Every Sunday, before kickoffs, these men gathered in smoke-filled rooms, comparing notes on injuries, weather reports, and rumors from locker rooms. Out of these conversations came the spreads that determined the flow of millions of dollars in illegal wagers. The concept of the point spread changed everything. It allowed gamblers to bet not on who would win, but by how much. This single adjustment transformed football into a perfect gambling sport. It meant that even a lopsided game could hold financial meaning until the last play. The spread was not random. It was crafted through observation, mathematics, and manipulation. Those who controlled it held power that rivaled the league itself. In Chicago, the outfit had already perfected this business through years of managing horse racing bets and underground casinos. Men like Tony Accardo and Paul Ricca operated empires built on quiet discipline. They understood that the secret to longevity was control, not chaos. Bookmaking offered exactly that. Unlike bootlegging or extortion, gambling did not require violence. It required reliability, discretion, and information. The outfit's network reached from the South Side to small towns across Illinois, each connected through coded phone calls and hand-delivered envelopes. Meanwhile, in New York, the five families were learning to adapt. Their traditional rackets were under pressure from federal investigations, but gambling offered an alternative that was less visible and just as profitable. The Lucchesi and Genovese families built alliances with bookmakers, while the Gambinos moved into managing runners who operated out of corner delis and social clubs. A single betting operation could handle thousands of dollars a day, all in cash, all untaxed, and all dependent on the reliability of the point spread. The families cooperated where necessary and competed where possible. Territory mattered less than trust. By the early 1950s, these criminal syndicates had created a parallel economy around sports. Football was only one piece of it, but it was becoming the most promising. Unlike baseball, which was slow and prone to scrutiny after the 1919 scandal, football offered constant movement, physical uncertainty, and unpredictable outcomes. It was a gambler's dream. The point spread became the currency of conversation in cities across the country. Men in barbershops debated whether the Browns could cover 3 points against the Bears, or whether a rainy afternoon in Chicago might tilt the game toward the underdog. These discussions sounded harmless, but every word was part of a much larger market. Behind the facade of casual betting was a network that operated with military precision. The syndicates gathered information from scouts, sports writers, and even stadium employees. They paid informants who worked for teams, sometimes just to learn who had missed practice or who was nursing an injury. A minor ankle sprain could shift the spread by half a point, and half a point could change where the money flowed. Accuracy meant profit. Inaccuracy meant loss. For organized crime, it was an equation worth protecting. When the first televised football games appeared, they were treated as novelties. But the mob recognized their value immediately. Television created visibility, and visibility created opportunity. A televised game allowed gamblers to track outcomes in real time, eliminating the need to rely on second-hand reports. More importantly, it expanded the customer base. Men who had never attended an NFL game could now watch from home, beer in hand, with a small wager that turned every drive into a personal investment. The game was no longer distant entertainment. It was interactive, emotional, and profitable. The outfit in Chicago began coordinating with bookmakers in other cities to standardize point spreads. This cooperation created what amounted to a national betting line. The practice reduced disputes, stabilized odds, and ensured that everyone in the system could operate with the same reference. It also gave organized crime a level of influence that extended beyond any single city. When a game began on Sunday, millions of dollars could hinge on a single call made days earlier in a back room. The NFL had no way of controlling this. The league did not issue official injury reports, and its leadership still viewed gambling as a distant nuisance rather than a central threat. Yet the reality was that the mob's understanding of football was becoming almost scientific. They tracked statistics with meticulous detail. They charted tendencies of referees and studied how certain teams performed in specific weather conditions. In many ways, organized crime had built the first analytical culture around football, long before the league itself embraced data. What made the operation work was anonymity. The bettors rarely knew who controlled the money, and the bookmakers rarely knew where their collections went. It was a pyramid of plausible deniability, shielded by cash transactions and coded language. A bet might be recorded as a purchase, a dinner tab, or a supply order. The authorities were aware of the existence of these operations, but enforcement was inconsistent. The FBI and local police departments were still focused on more visible crimes. Sports gambling was seen as a vice, not a national concern. This lack of oversight allowed the networks to flourish. By the mid-1950s, illegal betting on professional football was estimated to reach hundreds of millions of dollars annually. The true figure was likely higher. Each week, lines moved subtly, based on rumors and inside information. When large amounts of money appeared on one side, the syndicates would adjust the spread to rebalance action. The manipulation was artful, designed to maintain public confidence while ensuring profit regardless of the outcome. The mob's control of sports gambling created an odd relationship with the NFL. On one hand, the league publicly denounced betting, insisting that the sport remained pure. On the other hand, gambling quietly fueled interest. Fans who wagered money watched more games, read more coverage, and discussed results with greater intensity. Television ratings climbed, attendance rose, and the NFL's national footprint expanded. The league's success was unknowingly tied to the same system it condemned. Inside the syndicates, this irony was well understood. They knew that as long as football grew, their market would grow with it. The key was to stay invisible. The last thing they wanted was a scandal that brought federal attention, so they maintained their discipline, operating with strict rules. Bookmakers who attracted attention were replaced. Runners who stole or talked too much disappeared from the business. Every operation had its own silent code. The players were largely unaware of the vast machinery surrounding their sport. They heard whispers, they saw men waiting near hotels, but few understood the scale. To most, gambling seemed like background noise, something separate from the game itself. Only a handful of owners and officials knew how deep the roots had grown. The NFL was becoming both a sport and a commodity. Its statistics and outcomes traded like stock prices across a hidden economy. When television networks began paying the league for broadcast rights, the connection between visibility and profit became permanent. The mob no longer needed to bribe players to control results. They could profit simply by understanding probability better than anyone else. They studied the game not for passion, but for precision. Each point scored, each yard gained, became data in an empire that existed beyond public sight. The story of the point spread empire is not only about crime. It is about how a sport became a market, how entertainment became currency, and how organized systems of power found ways to thrive where oversight was weak. The men who built those networks shaped the modern culture of football more than anyone in the league would ever admit. Television brought light to the game, but it also deepened the shadows. For every camera broadcasting to the nation, there was a ledger recording the odds, a phone ringing in a back room, and a calculation made in silence. The more the public watched, the more invisible the system became. By the early 1950s, professional football had entered a fragile golden age. Attendance was climbing. Television was opening living rooms across America to the spectacle of Sunday afternoons. And the league office was eager to portray itself as the symbol of American discipline and teamwork. Yet beneath the polished veneer, whispers circulated through press boxes and locker rooms. Players had been seen with men who carried cash in quiet envelopes. Bookmakers seemed to know too much about injuries before the newspapers did. Point spreads shifted without warning. But in the NFL's inner circles, no one wanted to talk about it. The league had built its identity on control, and control meant silence. The commissioners of the time were aware of the risks. They understood that football's rise depended entirely on public trust. The memory of the 1919 baseball scandal still hung over American sports like a cautionary ghost. The Black Sox had shown the world how fragile a game's integrity could be, and the NFL could not afford to become the next cautionary tale. The leadership believed that perception mattered more than investigation. To keep the league clean, it was often easier to pretend that there was no dirt to uncover. That was the unspoken rule inside the offices of the league's headquarters. Never embarrass the shield. It was more than a slogan. It was a survival strategy. Every owner, coach, and player understood that the league's success was a shared illusion of order. The public wanted heroes, not hustlers. The sponsors wanted certainty, not scandal. If a rumor surfaced about a player's debts or an odd connection to a local bookmaker, it was dismissed quietly, buried under denials, and forgotten before it reached print. The cost of silence was heavy, but the league accepted it as the price of growth. Part of this culture came from the structure of the NFL itself. It was a collection of independent franchises, each fiercely protective of its autonomy. The commissioner could make recommendations, but investigations required cooperation from owners who feared the consequences of exposure. A single confirmed scandal could damage ticket sales, attract federal attention, and drive away advertisers. The logic was simple. If the problem was not seen, it did not exist. The league's greatest weapon was denial, and its greatest weakness was the truth it refused to face. Behind closed doors, owners held private meetings about how to protect their investments. Some argued for stricter player monitoring, others for closer relationships with law enforcement. Yet few wanted to act. Football players in the 1950s were not wealthy men. Many earned less than middle-class salaries, working off-season jobs to make ends meet. A public acknowledgement that players could be tempted by gamblers would reveal a flaw in the system. Instead of raising wages or enforcing education, the league chose to guard its image through secrecy. It was easier to police appearances than behavior. This silence spread through the locker rooms. Players who heard rumors knew not to repeat them. Veterans told rookies to focus on the game, not the gossip. Coaches warned their teams about associating with the wrong people, but the warnings were vague, almost ritualistic. Everyone knew what they meant, but no one said it out loud. The fear was not of the gamblers themselves, but of the consequences of being seen as disloyal to the league. Reputation was everything. A player accused of involvement with betting, even falsely, could see his career vanish overnight. The journalists of the time faced their own dilemma. Sports writers depended on access to teams for their stories. If they asked the wrong questions, their credentials could be revoked. Many knew that gamblers hovered near the edges of the sport, but they learned to phrase their suspicions carefully. Articles about unusual odds, movements, or unexpected injuries appeared occasionally, but the names were never printed. The press, like the league, was bound by an unspoken pact. Protect the image, protect the access. The public only saw what the league wanted them to see. Commissioner Bert Bell embodied this culture of cautious control. A former owner and coach, Bell was a pragmatic man who believed deeply in football's moral power. He implemented policies that prohibited players from betting on games and warned against associating with known gamblers. But enforcement was weak. The league had no investigative unit, no surveillance, and no real cooperation with law enforcement. Bell relied on personal trust and quiet discipline. He often said that football was built on honesty, but honesty was difficult to verify in a business that thrived on secrecy. Bell's leadership style reflected the tension of his era. He was both protector and promoter, trying to expand the game while shielding it from scandal. When reports of suspicious betting activity reached his office, he handled them privately. Some cases resulted in quiet warnings, others in unrecorded conversations. The philosophy was containment. As long as problems stayed hidden, the league could grow without interference. Public denial became the first line of defense. This approach created a strange dual reality. On the surface, the NFL projected integrity and unity. Behind that image, fear simmered. Owners feared that one exposed scandal could collapse their franchises. Players feared being accused of corruption even when innocent. Coaches feared losing control of locker rooms, filled with financial anxiety. The league had built a fortress of silence, but that fortress was cracking from within. In cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York, local law enforcement occasionally raided betting operations connected to organized crime. When the arrests made headlines, football's name was rarely mentioned, but insiders knew the connection. Bookmakers caught with ledgers often had football lines listed beside horse racing results. Yet the NFL's response was always the same: no comment. The league distanced itself from any implication, insisting that professional football remained untouched by the underworld. It was a message of reassurance repeated so often it began to sound like prayer. This public composure was not ignorance. The league knew that gambling interests were watching every game, adjusting odds and influencing markets. But it also knew that public outrage could destroy everything it had built. The 1950s were a decade of fragile optimism. Americans wanted to believe in institutions again after the war and the Depression. The NFL represented that belief. It was family entertainment, a symbol of teamwork and perseverance. To admit corruption would have been to betray the era's need for faith in something pure. Owners encouraged this illusion through their dealings with players. Many offered informal loans to help athletes avoid debt. These gestures were framed as paternal concern, but were often designed to keep financial troubles from becoming public. If a player owed money to a gambler, an owner might quietly pay it off, provided the story never left the room. The transactions were sealed by trust and fear. The player stayed silent, the owner protected his investment, and the league maintained its spotless image. Over time, this culture of silence became institutional. When young executives entered the league office, they learned quickly what topics were off-limits. Gambling was treated as superstition, something to be acknowledged only in passing. The NFL's official publications never mentioned point spreads, and the league's press releases ignored the growing betting culture entirely. This selective blindness gave the mob the space it needed to thrive. The less attention the league gave the problem, the more control organized crime gained over the narrative. The tension between public confidence and private fear defined the decade. The league's leaders celebrated record attendance and television contracts, while privately monitoring rumors that could destroy them. Each week brought the same contradiction: a game presented as wholesome American entertainment, supported by a betting economy the league refused to admit existed. The silence was both protection and confession. For the players, the contradiction was personal. They were told to uphold integrity, yet they lived in a world where temptation was constant and oversight was minimal. Many felt the weight of the league's expectations without receiving its protection. If they failed to live up to the image, they were disposable. If they succeeded, they were symbols of purity that the league could showcase. The truth was more complicated. The NFL's public purity depended on private compromise. By the end of the 1950s, the league's leadership had perfected its method. Scandals were buried, questions deflected, and loyalty demanded. But every time the NFL looked away, it gave the shadows more room to move. Silence had preserved the league's image, but it had also created a blind spot that would haunt it for decades to come. The men who enforced the code of Dante embarrassed the shield believed they were protecting the game. In reality, they were protecting the illusion, not the integrity. In the early 1950s, a professional football player could walk off the field after 60 minutes of bruises, broken fingers, and concussions, only to find a paycheck that barely covered the bills. The glamour that surrounded the sport today did not exist then. Stadiums were smaller, sponsorships were rare, and players were often anonymous outside their own neighborhoods. The average salary hovered around $5,000 a year, barely enough to support a family. I saw men earning $5,000 a year holding the fate of million-dollar bets, and that imbalance created the perfect storm for exploitation. For many players, football was not a lifelong career, but a temporary job. Few expected to play beyond their late 20s, and almost none had retirement plans or health coverage. Off-seasons were spent working in warehouses, selling insurance, or returning to family farms. Injuries could end a career instantly, and when that happened, there were no guarantees of support. The sense of insecurity hung over every locker room. Every tackle carried the unspoken question of what would happen if the next one was the last. It was in this uncertainty that the shadows found their opportunity. The men who handled the money, the bookmakers, and fixers, understood human need. They knew desperation when they saw it. They did not approach the stars, the few who had stable incomes and recognition. Instead, they sought out the linemen, the backups, the fringe players, fighting for a roster spot. These were the men who had no bargaining power, whose jobs could vanish with a single bad game. For them, a few $100s in cash could mean paying rent or keeping a family afloat. The mob understood that football was not just about competition. It was about human pressure. The sport demanded perfection from men who lived on the edge of financial ruin. When a bookmaker slipped an envelope across a bar counter, it was not framed as corruption, but as help. A small loan. A friendly advance. No strings attached, at least not at first. The player who accepted it might never intend to influence a game. He might think of it as a harmless favor. But once the connection was made, it rarely disappeared. The economic realities of the league created a hierarchy of vulnerability. Owners were insulated by wealth and influence. Coaches had steady salaries, but the players, especially the lower-tier ones, carried the risk with no safety net. They were the ones living week to week, nursing injuries they could not afford to treat properly. A broken finger meant a smaller paycheck. A missed game meant questions about commitment. Every decision had financial consequences. The mob did not need to threaten these men. The world already had. Looking back, it is difficult to imagine a league that demanded so much and gave so little. Today's athletes sign contracts worth millions, protected by agents, unions, and collective bargaining. But in the 1950s, the NFL Players Association barely existed. There were no guaranteed contracts, no grievance systems, and no standard for player benefits. Most athletes had no choice but to accept whatever terms were offered. They played hurt because missing a game could mean losing their place on the roster. They accepted off-season loans from men whose names they barely knew because there were no alternatives. This economic desperation became the quiet entry point for organized crime. Mob-controlled bookmakers knew that football was a growth market. Television had made the game accessible to millions, and betting on outcomes had become a national pastime. But to manipulate those outcomes, they needed access, and access began with relationships. A gambler who befriended a player under financial stress did not need to make explicit offers. He only needed patience. Over time, the player's gratitude turned to dependence. In many cases, these relationships stayed invisible. A player might accept small loans or gifts without ever changing his performance. But the very existence of that debt gave the gambler leverage. The threat was never spoken directly. It did not need to be. The player knew that his name could be ruined if word spread about who he was seen with. That subtle control was more effective than intimidation. It created loyalty, built on fear and shame. I remember stories from old-timers who spoke of the unspoken understanding in locker rooms. If someone started getting too comfortable with outsiders who talked about betting, teammates would quietly distance themselves. Not because they disapproved, but because they knew how fast reputations could collapse. A single rumor could end a career. The NFL's leadership had made it clear that gambling associations were grounds for immediate expulsion. But they offered no system to help players avoid those associations in the first place. It was punishment without protection. For owners, the economic imbalance was profitable. Low salaries meant low overhead. Even as attendance grew and television revenue increased, the benefits rarely reached the players. The league's public relations narrative painted football as a brotherhood of honor and grit. But behind that myth was an economic system that left players exposed. The same men who risked their bodies every week were the ones most susceptible to outside influence. And those influences understood exactly how to use money as a weapon. Consider a running back who spent 6 seasons in the league, earning a few $1,000s each year. When his career ended, he had nothing saved. If a bookmaker offered him $200 to share information about a teammate's injury or the mood in the locker room, it might not feel like betrayal. It might feel like survival. These small exchanges rarely made headlines, but they built the foundation for the mob's network of informants inside the sport. Each piece of information helped shape the betting markets. Each secret sold was another step toward control. The league's public silence on player pay only deepened the problem. The NFL marketed itself as a patriotic institution, celebrating the toughness of its players as a reflection of American values. The idea of financial struggle did not fit that image. So the players' hardships were erased from public conversation. Fans saw warriors on the field, not men worrying about overdue bills or medical costs. That illusion of prosperity made the corruption even harder to detect. When the public believes the players are untouchable, it cannot imagine how easily they can be bought. As the decade progressed, television transformed the sport into a national spectacle. Ratings climbed, advertisers lined up, and stadiums expanded. Yet the players' salaries lagged far behind the profits. The growing wealth of the league made the contrast even starker. Every dollar that flowed through the system made the men on the field feel more replaceable. It was the perfect environment for quiet compromises. The economic vulnerability of the players became the moral vulnerability of the league. The NFL's leaders claimed to protect integrity while allowing the conditions that endangered it. They preached about honor and loyalty while leaving their players to navigate poverty and temptation alone. When scandals eventually surfaced in other sports, the NFL congratulated itself on its cleanliness, never acknowledging that it had been built on silence rather than immunity. The truth is that corruption rarely begins with greed. It begins with need. The men who played in that era did not see themselves as criminals or conspirators. They saw themselves as workers, doing what they had to do to survive. In a world that offered them glory without security, they learned that every favor carried a price. Some paid it willingly, others without realizing it until it was too late. The mob did not need to threaten the NFL with violence or exposure. It simply needed to wait. It waited for the next injury, the next unpaid bill, the next man too proud to ask for help from his team, but not too proud to accept it from someone else. That patience made organized crime not an outside force pressing against the sport, but an invisible partner quietly shaping it. The NFL grew, but so did the shadows. Both fed on the same hunger for money, and both depended on the same silence. By the time the league began to realize the depth of the problem, it was already too late. The gamblers were not just on the fringes of the sport anymore. They were part of its bloodstream. And the players who had once seen themselves as untouchable were learning that integrity was a luxury they could not afford. By 1950, America was at war with something it could not see. Not a foreign power, not a military enemy, but an invisible network of control that slipped through back rooms, wire rooms, and betting parlors. When Senator Estes Kefauver took his seat before the Senate's Special Committee to investigate organized crime in interstate commerce, few could have imagined how far the tendrils of corruption reached. What began as an inquiry into illegal rackets soon became a national mirror, showing Americans what they had tried not to see: how deeply organized crime had woven itself into everyday life. The hearings began in New Orleans and spread across the country. Kefauver and his committee subpoenaed mob figures, police chiefs, and gamblers. Cameras rolled for the first time in a Senate investigation, and millions of Americans watched the faces of men who had operated in secrecy for decades. Their expressions were calm, their answers calculated, their confidence chilling. The spectacle made corruption feel personal. It was no longer hidden in newspaper columns or whispered rumors. It was alive on television screens. The hearings exposed the machinery behind gambling syndicates. Bookmakers were not working alone in smoke-filled rooms. They were part of structured organizations connected to labor unions, political offices, and in some cases, professional sports. Betting lines were being transmitted across state borders through wire services, allowing mob families to track, influence, and control where money flowed. These revelations shook the public's faith in the purity of sport. Baseball had already suffered from the 1919 Black Sox scandal, and college athletics were tainted by point-shaving incidents. The NFL feared it might be next. Inside league headquarters, Commissioner Bert Bell understood the danger. Bell had been a coach, an owner, and a man who loved football's integrity, but he also knew the reality of its vulnerability. Player salaries were modest, and the league lacked the centralized control that would come decades later. In 1950, the NFL had no true public relations armor, no modern investigative unit. It relied on trust and silence, hoping that loyalty would keep temptation away. But loyalty meant little when a player's paycheck could not cover his rent. The Kefauver hearings did not name NFL players or officials directly, but they did not need to. The message was clear. Gambling money touched everything. Wire service operators like James Ragan had already testified about the national networks used by the Chicago outfit to control sports betting. Ragan himself was shot before he could reveal more. The committee followed his trail, uncovering connections between underworld financiers and legitimate businesses. Behind every bookie stood a boss. Behind every bet, a percentage was skimmed for protection. Kefauver's team learned that many mob-controlled wire services operated in cities that were also home to professional football teams. Chicago, New York, Cleveland, and Detroit were all on the map. The same men who controlled the odds in boxing and horse racing were rumored to have their eyes on football as it grew in popularity. The problem was not that games were being fixed regularly, it was that no one could be sure they were in T. That uncertainty alone was poison to public confidence. Privately, league owners feared that a single exposed scandal could collapse their fragile progress. The NFL was finally gaining traction thanks to television and radio. Stadium attendance was rising. Families were beginning to see football as America's new pastime. Any whiff of organized crime involvement could undo that overnight. Bert Bell worked tirelessly to convince reporters and senators that his league was clean. He wrote letters, attended hearings as a silent observer, and met with investigators to assure them that football was different. But the truth was more complicated. The NFL's structure made it vulnerable. Unlike baseball, which had a long-standing commissioner system with investigative power, football still operated like a coalition of small businesses. Owners guarded their territories and often resisted interference from the league office. That independence was fertile ground for outside influence. Gamblers understood that the NFL had no unified wall of defense. They did not need to own a team or bribe officials. They only needed access to players who were underpaid and overworked. During the hearings, Kefauver himself hinted that professional sports had not yet been fully examined. He believed that gambling's reach was not confined to one sport or level. When asked if the committee planned to investigate the NFL, he replied cautiously that no organization could be considered beyond suspicion. Those words sent a quiet shock through league circles. Behind closed doors, team executives discussed ways to tighten control over players' off-field activities. Some teams began to monitor known gamblers in their cities, while others simply hoped to avoid attention. The public viewed Kefauver as a hero. He had pulled back the curtain on America's hidden empire of vice. His televised hearings drew record audiences, rivaling entertainment programs of the day. People saw senators grilling mob bosses who had ruled by fear for decades. They saw the underworld forced into the light. But behind the triumph was an unspoken fear that exposure might lead to collapse. If fans began to question whether their favorite games were pure, the illusion of competition itself could crumble. In that tension, the NFL found both protection and danger. The hearings focused heavily on cities and industries already stained by scandal, which allowed football to avoid the worst headlines. But the relief was temporary. The league knew that the same economic and social pressures that made college athletes vulnerable also existed in their locker rooms. The difference was that professional players had more to lose if caught and less support if accused. Burt Bell began quietly consulting with law enforcement figures, asking for informal updates on gambling activity involving football. He pushed for stronger language in player contracts about association with gamblers, but enforcement remained minimal. The league was still too small, its reach too limited to truly police its own ranks. Many team owners resented the idea of league interference. They saw gambling as a cultural reality, not an existential threat. The Kefauver Hearings closed in 1951, but their aftershocks lingered. They led to new state laws targeting wire services and prompted the creation of federal task forces to monitor organized crime. In the following years, several gambling networks were dismantled. But the structure adapted rather than disappeared. Bookmakers became more careful. Payoffs became quieter. And for the NFL, the danger became harder to trace. The league's response was to build its public image around morality. Football was sold as the embodiment of American character discipline, teamwork, resilience. It was no coincidence that this image emerged directly after a national reckoning with corruption. The NFL's clean-cut presentation was both a shield and a statement. But those within the game knew the truth. The same forces that had fueled the Kefauver hearings still existed in the shadows. They had simply learned to whisper instead of shout. In hindsight, the Kefauver years marked a turning point. They transformed organized crime from a regional problem into a national conversation. They gave birth to the televised scandal and the politics of exposure. And for the NFL, they introduced a new kind of vigilance. Every time a player met a stranger in a bar, every time an owner received an anonymous letter, the question lingered. Was it a fan, or was it a test? The league would survive the decade intact, but its leaders never forgot what they saw in those hearings. The faces of the mobsters, calm and composed under questioning, reminded them that corruption did not announce itself. It arrived wearing a smile, offering friendship, pretending to love the game as much as everyone else. That quiet truth would shape every decision the NFL made in the years to come. They were always there, though few dared to say it aloud. Men in gray coats, hats pulled low, sitting near the 50-yard line or pacing along the sidelines with quiet intensity. They never cheered, never seemed to care which team scored. Their interest was colder, mathematical. They were fixers, observers, middlemen who carried messages for men who never showed their faces in public. Players noticed them even if they pretended not to. Everyone did. And in those silent exchanges of glances between the field and the stands, a different game was being played. By the early 1950s, football stadiums were no longer just gathering places for fans. They were theaters of risk. The crowd came for spectacle, but buried beneath the cheers were calculations. Bookmakers kept ledgers in their pockets. Hand signals flashed from section to section. Odds shifted with every fumble, every injury, every uncertain call from the referee. Men who looked like ordinary spectators were, in truth, part of an invisible network that reached from small-town taverns to backroom counting houses in Chicago and New York. Some of them followed specific teams across the country. Others stayed local, reporting to their superiors through payphones after each quarter. They noted player moods, substitutions, injuries that were not announced to the public. It was not unusual to see one of them speaking quietly to a stadium usher or a team attendant before kickoff. Nothing overt ever happened in plain view, but those who understood the game's darker undercurrent knew these were moments of exchange. A favor traded, a payment promised, a rumor verified. Players learned to live with the presence of these men. Some ignored them, others feared them, and a few sought them out in desperation. The 1950s NFL was still years away from television riches. Salaries remained modest. A rookie might earn $5,000 for an entire season. Injuries could end careers overnight. For many, the idea of a man offering extra cash in exchange for a few whispered details felt like survival, not betrayal. It was never about throwing a game, at least not at first. Sometimes it was as simple as revealing whether a star halfback's knee was still sore or whether a coach planned to rest his quarterback. To gamblers, such information was gold. The fixers worked quietly. They blended into the crowd, never drawing attention. Yet their presence altered everything. Players became self-conscious, wondering who might be watching. Coaches lectured about loyalty, warning players to avoid outsiders, though everyone knew it was impossible to avoid them completely. Even small-town newspapers carried whispers about unfamiliar faces loitering near practice fields or buying rounds at local bars. Some teams hired security, but it did little good. The fixers were always one step ahead. Fear began to spread in subtle ways. A missed field goal was no longer just a mistake. It became a question. Was it nerves or something else? A fumble near the goal line drew uneasy glances. The public rarely noticed, but within locker rooms, suspicion became a quiet sickness. Players trusted one another on the field, but not always off it. No one wanted to believe that anyone could be compromised. Yet every man knew how fragile life in the league could be. There were rumors of players approached in hotel lobbies, offered envelopes stuffed with cash just to keep a game within the spread. Some said no, some said yes, and most said nothing. The league discouraged discussion of such matters. To speak of it was to risk your job. The NFL needed to project integrity, and silence was its first defense. Burt Bell's office sent memos warning teams to report any suspicious contact, but those reports were rarely followed by action. The fear of scandal outweighed the need for transparency. For gamblers, the fix did not always mean a complete manipulation of results. It could mean controlling the margin, influencing a single play, or ensuring that a certain player remained sidelined. These small manipulations were easier to hide and more profitable than outright game fixing. The point spread became the invisible ruler by which loyalty was tested. It dictated the flow of money and the rhythm of suspicion. When players looked up into the stands and saw those silent watchers, they felt the weight of that unspoken power. The psychological toll was immense. Some veterans spoke later in life about the paranoia that crept into the game during that era. They remembered the feeling of being hunted, not by opponents, but by expectation. A bad game could invite scrutiny, a great one could invite danger. Coaches told their men to play hard and stay clean, but those words felt hollow against the quiet menace of the unseen. In cities like Chicago and New York, the line between fan and criminal was often blurred. The mob had money in every major sport, and football was no exception. Sports bars doubled as fronts for betting operations. Bartenders memorized lines and odds like prayers. Patrons placed bets as easily as ordering drinks. Some fixers operated out of hotels where visiting teams stayed, making casual conversation in lobbies or elevators. They gathered information without ever asking direct questions. A player's limp, a coach's sigh, a trainer's comment about tape or eye-sit was all data. The league's public stance remained firm. Professional football was clean, but the truth was more complicated. Behind closed doors, owners exchanged uneasy letters about the growing gambling problem. They feared not just corruption, but exposure. The Kefauver Hearings had taught them that a single televised scandal could destroy a reputation overnight. So they chose the safest course: denial. To the press, the NFL insisted that its players were men of honor. Behind the scenes, it quietly warned them to stay away from anyone who asked too many questions. Some of the fixers became legends in their own circles. There was the man who always carried a silver cigarette case engraved with initials that were not his own. The one who sat in the front row and never seemed to blink. Another was known for tipping hotel staff generously in exchange for access to room lists. They were ghosts of a kind, moving from city to city. Their names whispered, but never proven. Each represented the same truth, that power did not always sit in the commissioner's office or the owner's box. Sometimes it sat 3 rows behind the bench, watching without emotion. For players, the strain of living under constant observation became part of the job. Some hardened themselves against it, focusing on the game and pretending not to notice. Others carried the weight long after retirement. They remembered those silent figures and the questions they left behind. How much of what happened on the field was pure? How much was controlled by unseen hands? Those doubts eroded trust in ways statistics could never measure. In retrospect, this era was not defined by proven scandals, but by the atmosphere of fear that surrounded them. It was an age of implication, where the absence of evidence did not bring comfort, but suspicion. The mob did not need to fix every game. It only needed to make players believe that it could. That belief alone gave it power. Looking back, the image of those trench-coated men standing by the field remains one of the haunting symbols of the time. They represented the meeting of 2 worlds, sport and crime, innocence and control. To the casual fan, they were nobodies, just spectators in the crowd. To those who played the game, they were reminders that the stakes extended far beyond the scoreboard. In the 1950s NFL, every cheer echoed against the quiet knowledge that someone, somewhere, was betting not just on who would win, but on who might falter. The players carried that awareness into every huddle and every snap. It was an invisible pressure, a shadow that stretched from the stands onto the field itself. The mob did not need to own football to influence it. It only needed to be present, watching, waiting, calculating. He was only 24 when the whispers began. A halfback with speed that looked effortless and a smile that made him a favorite in the locker room. He had come from a small college, one of those schools where the stands were wooden and the cheerleaders passed around the same megaphone year after year. To him, football had been a way out, a path towards something steady. But in the 1950s NFL, innocence was fragile currency. It started with a rumor in the local press. A single paragraph buried between stories about civic parades and election speeches. The article suggested that certain players might have been seen in the company of gamblers. No names were mentioned, but everyone in town knew which player it meant. Reporters began calling his family home. The team denied any knowledge, but within days, the league office quietly suspended him pending investigation. No hearing, no chance to explain. One morning, he had been a professional athlete, and by evening, he was a liability. He had done nothing wrong. His only mistake was sitting at the wrong table in a downtown diner, eating breakfast while 2 men nearby discussed a betting line. One of them happened to be under investigation for illegal wagering. When investigators traced his whereabouts, the player's name appeared in the notes. In that climate of suspicion, that was enough. There were no charges, no confessions, no evidence. Only the fear that another headline might appear if the league did not act first. The fallout was devastating. Teammates stopped calling. Reporters camped outside his apartment. The public turned quickly, the way crowds always do when morality becomes entertainment. Neighbors who once congratulated him on his touchdowns now crossed the street to avoid eye contact. Even his old coach, a man who had once called him the most honest player he had ever known, told him to lay low for a while. Those words were meant kindly, but they felt like a sentence. The league's internal files would later show that the investigation turned up nothing of substance, but by then, the damage was complete. His name had become a warning. A whisper passed between coaches and executives. A player who drew attention from gamblers, whether intentional or not, was a player who could never again be trusted. His career was over before his 25th birthday. The human cost of suspicion was something few outside the game could understand. In the public eye, these men were heroes on Sunday and forgotten by Monday. But beneath the surface, they were living through a period of quiet persecution. The NFL was desperate to prove that it was clean, and to do that, it needed examples. When even a hint of scandal appeared, the easiest way to preserve the illusion of purity was to sacrifice an individual. The league could not risk another sport's downfall. At the same time, college basketball was in flames. The point-shaving scandals that erupted in the early 1950s destroyed the reputations of entire programs. Players from Kentucky, CCNY, and Bradley had taken bribes to control margins. The revelations shocked the country. Headlines screamed betrayal. America learned that its beloved student-athletes could be bought for the price of a new suit and a handful of cash. To the NFL, it was a warning from the future. If the same rot spread to professional football, it could kill the league before it ever reached maturity. Commissioner Bert Bell watched the scandals unfold with dread. He had built his leadership on integrity, telling anyone who would listen that football was about honor and sacrifice. The thought of corruption infecting his league was unbearable. In private correspondence, he instructed his lieutenants to eliminate all threats, no matter how small. The result was a culture of fear, one that punished even the innocent. A player did not need to take money to lose his career. He only needed to be seen in the wrong photograph or mentioned in the wrong rumor. The young halfback story was repeated in smaller ways across the decade. Assistant coaches dismissed without explanation. Trainers relocated after someone overheard a conversation about odds. The press rarely reported these details, but the locker rooms remembered. Every man learned the same lesson. Guilt was not a matter of proof, but of perception. In the war to protect the league's image, no one was safe. The tragedy of that time was not just the corruption that existed, but the paranoia it created. The majority of players were honest, focused only on the game, yet they lived in constant fear of association. They stopped visiting certain bars, avoided teammates who gambled legally on horse races, and refused to sign autographs for men who looked like bookmakers. The purity of the sport was measured not by what happened on the field, but by the anxieties that surrounded it. Those who fell victim to false accusations rarely recovered. There were no public apologies, no reinstatements. The league moved forward, always forward, leaving behind the bodies of those who had served as warnings. A few found work as high school coaches or salesmen. Most simply faded away, their stories buried beneath the myth of football's innocence. Years later, when some of them spoke to journalists or historians, their voices still carried the weight of that betrayal. They did not curse the league. They mourned it, because they had loved it too much to believe it could turn against them. In the culture of the 1950s, reputation was everything. A man accused of dishonor might as well have been convicted. The FBI kept quiet files on suspected sports corruption, but those files rarely told the full story. They recorded accusations, not absolutions. And once your name appeared in one, you never escaped it. The young halfback's file would remain open for more than a decade before being marked inactive. By then, he was working in a warehouse, his knee long-healed, his spirit not so much. The fear of becoming another casualty kept most players silent. They saw what happened to those who spoke out or defended the accused. The media had no appetite for nuance. In the court of public opinion, silence equaled guilt and outrage sold papers. The result was a generation of athletes who learned to police themselves, to hide their friendships, and to question every gesture of kindness from strangers. It was a lonely existence built on survival. This was the hidden cost of the league's pursuit of purity. The NFL of the 1950s built its credibility by projecting control, by assuring the public that every game was honest and every player virtuous. But beneath that facade was an institution ruled by fear. It punished whispers more severely than actions, and in doing so, it transformed integrity from a moral principle into a weapon. When historians later describe the period as the era of innocence, they were only half right. It was innocent in the sense that the money was smaller, the crowds less polished, the spectacle still finding its shape. But the human cost of that innocence was immense. It required scapegoats, men whose lives would serve as cautionary tales so that the league could continue unblemished. The young player never set foot on an NFL field again. His records remained in the archives, his statistics untouched, his story untold. Yet his shadow lingered, a reminder that sometimes the game destroyed its own to preserve the illusion of purity. He was neither corrupt nor heroic, only caught in the undertow of a system that valued silence over truth. The fall of the innocent game was not marked by a single scandal or a dramatic confession. It happened quietly, in whispers and rumors, in careers ended without explanation. It was the moment when football stopped being merely a sport and became an institution guarding its own mythology. And once that transformation began, it would never fully reverse. The deeper investigators dug, the more they realized that organized crime didn't always look like the crime stories Americans were used to. There were no smoky backrooms with poker chips scattered across the floor. No obvious villains counting their takeover whiskey and cigars. In the 1950s, the machinery of mob money in sports ran quietly beneath the surface, disguised by polished suits, respectable offices, and legitimate business fronts. The underworld was learning how to appear clean. The betting networks that reached into the National Football League operated through a labyrinth of middlemen, dummy corporations, and bank accounts that never stayed open long enough for authorities to follow. The money moved fast, changing hands and identities before it could be traced. It was not just gambling anymore. It had evolved into a shadow economy. Investigators from the Treasury and the FBI found themselves running in circles. Each lead dissolved into another alias, another post office box, another accountant who claimed to know nothing about the cash that passed through his ledgers. Many of these men were bookkeepers by title, but couriers by function. They transported not briefcases of bills, but envelopes stuffed with betting receipts and coded records. The trail would begin in a corner bar in Chicago or Cleveland, then move through a dry cleaning business in New Jersey, and end with a transfer at a legitimate bank in Miami or Kansas City. What connected it all was trust, the kind of trust that could only be enforced by fear. The mob had long understood that visibility was the enemy of profit. So they built layers of distance between the source and the beneficiary. At the bottom were the local runners, small-time operators who took bets from fans, players, and even coaches. They worked the phone lines on Sundays, scribbling numbers and names on matchbooks and slips of paper. Those slips went to a collector, who passed them to an accountant, who sent summaries to a regional office run by someone with real influence. By the time the proceeds reached a mob-connected business, the paper trail was unrecognizable. The game's outcome determined not just who won money, but which front stayed open and which quietly disappeared overnight. Law enforcement knew the money existed, but rarely caught anyone with it. It was always one step removed, washed through nightclubs, vending companies, and construction firms that did just enough legitimate work to look clean. When auditors questioned their sudden profits, the books always showed contracts and invoices that seemed perfectly ordinary. Behind those pages, the mob was washing millions in gambling proceeds from sports betting, horse racing, and numbers games. The NFL was one of the newest additions to their portfolio, and it offered something rare: public legitimacy. To the mob, the league was not just entertainment, it was a respectable vehicle for dirty money. For the average player, it was impossible to see this machinery. They knew of the whispers, the men in tailored suits who offered quiet loans or congratulated them after a big win. Some players thought of them as fans. Others knew better but stayed silent. The line between casual friendship and criminal association blurred when a man offered to pay your bar tab or send money to your struggling family. The league's low salaries made that temptation even harder to resist. And behind those offers were silent investors who never met the players they paid. One famous case involved a team booster in the Midwest who also happened to own a chain of laundromats. On paper, he was a hard-working local businessman with a passion for football. In reality, his laundromats were nothing more than cash filters for a regional gambling network. The betting slips came in on Monday mornings hidden inside laundry bags, and by Wednesday, the money had been cleaned, counted, and redistributed through a web of corporate accounts. Investigators eventually traced the operation, but the owner died in a car crash before trial. The files disappeared shortly after. There were countless stories like that, operations too complex to prove, too widespread to contain. The mob had evolved beyond the brutality of street crime. It moved through the economy like an infection without symptoms. Its strength lay in its respectability. Even the men running these networks dressed for church, attended charity dinners, and shook hands with local politicians. The phrase often whispered in those years was simple but chilling. Everyone was getting paid. Inside league offices, there was nervous awareness, but little action. The NFL's public relations arms spent far more time reassuring journalists than questioning who was sitting in the owner's box. The leadership's focus was image protection, not internal policing. The last thing they wanted was a scandal that would send advertisers and families away from the sport. If a player's name surfaced in connection with gamblers, the matter was handled quietly, often with a warning or a transfer. The priority was to preserve faith in the game. Privately, law enforcement agents grew frustrated. They could raid betting houses and seize records, but without cooperation from inside the sport, the trail always went cold. The mob understood that as long as the NFL wanted to appear untouched, no one within it would testify. The silence became its own form of protection. It shielded both sides of the league from embarrassment, and the underworld from exposure. Yet even within that silence, there were those who noticed patterns. Bank clerks flagged unusual cash deposits from individuals tied to sports promotions. Journalists began to ask why certain gamblers always seemed to predict the spreads with uncanny accuracy. Investigators traced telephone records linking mob bookies to names that matched league employees. None of it amounted to proof, but each fragment hinted at a larger truth. Organized crime had built a reliable system, and professional football was one of its safest channels. Looking back, it is easy to see the elegance of it all. The mob didn't need to threaten anyone. They needed only to make themselves useful. They funded gambling operations, offered liquidity in cash-strapped moments, and extended favors that could not be traced. Their presence in the game was like water beneath a frozen lake, invisible from the surface, but shaping everything above it. For those who studied the financial side of sports during that period, one phrase captured it best. It wasn't just crime, it was business, dressed in Sunday suits. The men involved believed they were part of something legitimate, something bigger than themselves. They talked about market dynamics, not racketeering. They used the language of finance and strategy, not coercion and fear. That veneer made all the difference. It allowed corruption to coexist with civility and ambition to hide within morality. The structure held for years because no one wanted to break it. The players wanted to play, the owners wanted profit, and the public wanted heroes. As long as the games continued and the headlines stayed clean, the system kept breathing. But beneath the applause, money changed hands that would one day alter the sport's history. The truth about that era is that the league's greatest weakness was its players or its referees. It was its comfort with what it refused to see. By the mid-1950s, the players didn't need official instructions to know the rules. They lived by a code that was never written but universally understood. You didn't talk about point spreads, you didn't make small talk with the men who lingered near the locker room doors after games. And if you saw a stranger with a perfect haircut and too many questions about who was injured or who might sit out next Sunday, you walked the other way. The fear of gambling had become part of the NFL's bloodstream. It governed behavior as much as any playbook. That unspoken discipline came from survival. A player's career was fragile, his paycheck small, and his reputation, everything. To be accused of talking to a bookmaker was enough to end a man's life in football. The league's public image depended on purity, and purity depended on fear. Coaches whispered warnings to rookies before their first game checks cleared. Stay away from anyone asking about the team's mood. Never answer questions about injuries. Never borrow money. Those weren't just suggestions. They were commandments disguised as advice. The league offices reinforced that message with carefully worded memos. These bulletins, sent quietly to team owners and coaches, reminded everyone that gambling connections posed an existential threat to professional football. They spoke in formal language, warning that the reputation of the game must be protected at all costs. Behind those words was a blunt reality. One misstep could unravel the league's credibility. Even a rumor could invite congressional hearings or newspaper exposes. The NFL understood how fragile public trust could be, especially in the wake of betting scandals that had already devastated college basketball. Players learned early to treat outsiders with suspicion. A man at a bar might buy you a drink and casually ask about an injury. Another might offer to cover your travel expenses or provide tickets for family. Every small act of generosity came with invisible strings. The veterans told the younger players not to take anything, not even a cab ride, from someone they didn't know. The fear was not of violence or blackmail, but of guilt by association. To be seen in the company of a known gambler was to risk being labeled compromised. The league would not ask questions. It would simply close its doors. Inside locker rooms, the talk of gambling took on a strange rhythm. It was everywhere in the world outside, yet forbidden inside. Reporters printed the odds. Fans discussed them openly. But within the team, silence reigned. Players might joke about a bad beat or a missed field goal that cost gamblers money, but the laughter was uneasy. The code had shaped their language. They spoke in generalities, never specifics, because specifics could be dangerous. Even the team staff followed the same caution. Trainers, assistants, and equipment men knew the boundaries. They were instructed not to share any injury details outside the building. If a player limped, it stayed inside the walls. The logic was simple. Information was currency, and gamblers would pay for it. A player with a sore knee could swing the betting line. A single phone call could shift thousands of dollars. Every bruise became confidential. The stigma attached to gambling reached deep into the culture of football. To be accused of taking money from gamblers was not just a professional disgrace, but a moral one. It marked a man as weak, dishonest, and unworthy of the game. The players who had seen teammates expelled or blacklisted carried that fear into every interaction. It became part of how they measured character. Trust was not only about blocking and tackling, it was about knowing who could be counted on to keep the game clean. Some players tried to keep distance by building lives far from temptation. They avoided nightclubs, kept to their families, and steered clear of any setting that might connect them to gamblers. But it was not always easy. The same men who funded illegal betting operations also invested in legitimate businesses that sponsored teams or local charities. The overlap blurred the boundaries. A player could attend a civic event, shake hands with a donor, and later discover that the man ran a betting parlor downtown. The guilt was often accidental, but the damage could be irreversible. Coaches enforced discipline in subtle ways. They monitored who players spent time with and what stories appeared in the press. A player seen in the wrong company could find himself benched without explanation. The message was always clear, even when unspoken. Protect the shield. Protect the game. The phrase carried weight that went beyond marketing. It was an oath that bound everyone who wore the uniform or drew a paycheck from the league. The fear of losing that identity was enough to keep most men silent, obedient, and careful. Yet beneath that obedience, there was unease. The players knew that the same league that punished them for even appearing connected to gambling had long tolerated owners and sponsors who profited from similar circles. The hypocrisy was not lost on them. Some of the most powerful figures in the sport had financial ties to entertainment companies and clubs that ran on the edge of legality. But the code did not apply to the top. It existed to keep the lower ranks pure, while the higher levels navigated the gray zones of influence and profit. That imbalance bred quiet resentment. For many, the stigma of gambling became inseparable from identity. The idea that a football player must remain morally untouched was drilled into them from training camp onward. To gamble was to betray the brotherhood. To even appear friendly with gamblers was to invite exile. The stories of ruined careers circulated like cautionary myths. Men who had been caught talking to the wrong people became warnings for everyone else. Their names faded, replaced by the moral lesson they left behind. That paranoia, however, also created isolation. Players trusted fewer people, spoke less freely, and often carried suspicion into their personal lives. A phone call from an old friend who now worked in entertainment could raise alarms. A casual conversation with a journalist could be misinterpreted. The code had kept the game clean, but it also stripped away some of its humanity. The players existed in a constant state of vigilance. Still, most accepted it as necessary. They knew that the public saw gambling as a moral contagion. Football's growing audience in the 1950s wanted to believe that their heroes were different from the gamblers and hustlers of the world. To keep that illusion alive, the league built walls of silence. It preferred the appearance of honor to the messy truth of reality. The players bore the burden of maintaining that illusion even when it meant sacrificing normal friendships and ordinary freedoms. In time, that culture of silence hardened into tradition. The code became folklore, passed from generation to generation. It shaped how players saw the outside world and how the world saw them. Every locker room speech about pride and integrity carried echoes of that unspoken fear. Protect the game. Don't talk to the wrong people. Don't give them a reason to question who we are. It was both a warning and a prayer. Looking back, it is easy to see how deeply that code defined the era. The players weren't just guarding against gamblers. They were protecting their own existence in a system built on image and trust. Every handshake was weighed. Every conversation judged. To survive, they learned discretion the way others learned strategy. It wasn't written in any manual, but it was the most important rule of all. When the first professional football games were broadcast nationwide, few could have imagined the ripple it would send through the American landscape. The flicker of black and white screens carried more than entertainment into living rooms. It carried access, intimacy, and exposure. The game that had once belonged to stadium crowds and Sunday afternoon gatherings now lived in the quiet center of American households. The roar of the crowd became part of the national rhythm, and with it came attention from those who had always followed money wherever it moved. Television changed everything for the NFL. It brought prestige and new audiences, but it also brought scrutiny. The camera caught every fumble, every injury, every questionable call. With each broadcast, the stakes grew higher, not only for teams, but for those who had long profited from uncertainty. Organized crime saw opportunity in the very thing that was supposed to purify the sport. The more people watched, the more people bet. And the more people bet, the deeper the underworld reached into the heart of the game. In living rooms across America, fans began tracking not just wins and losses, but margins. Point spreads became part of conversation, woven into the language of the sport. It no longer mattered only who won. What mattered was by how much. The networks may have never mentioned it, but gamblers knew that every field goal and every turnover shifted fortunes. What television offered to families as drama, it offered to bookies as business. The mob understood numbers. They recognized patterns before most league officials did. Betting volumes surged alongside viewership. When an estimated 10 million Americans began watching professional football by the mid-1950s, the underground market ballooned. New betting offices opened quietly behind bars and restaurants. In cities like Chicago, New York, and Detroit, mob run operations found a new rhythm aligned with kickoff times. Illegal bookmakers could now gauge public mood from television highlights, adjusting spreads and odds in real time. The game had become a live marketplace of risk and profit. For the players, fame arrived with unfamiliar consequences. Before television, most athletes were known by name only to local fans. Now their faces appeared in national broadcasts, their performances scrutinized by strangers from coast to coast. With that visibility came vulnerability. Gamblers could now study every pattern of play, every habit, every hesitation. They knew which quarterback hesitated under pressure, which kicker struggled in wind, which team folded late in games. Knowledge was power, and in the world of betting, power was currency. The league saw the benefits, but also the danger. Television brought money from advertising and new sponsorships, but it also magnified any hint of scandal. A single exposed connection between a player and a gambler could now travel across the country overnight. The image of the NFL as clean, disciplined, and American could shatter in an instant. That fear shaped how executives dealt with problems. Silence was no longer enough. They needed control. The league began monitoring who attended games and where they sat. It worked quietly with law enforcement to keep known gamblers out of press boxes and locker room areas. Stadium security became a matter of public relations as much as safety. The idea was to keep corruption unseen, or better yet, out of sight entirely. But as television expanded the audience, it also expanded temptation. Every new broadcast meant more people betting on the outcome, more money exchanging hands, more pressure on players whose salaries lagged far behind the sums being wagered. For organized crime, football offered something new. Baseball had been the gambling empire's foundation for decades, but football's unpredictability gave it unique allure. Point spreads created endless variables, allowing manipulation without outright fixing. A single play could determine millions in payouts. And because the NFL played relatively few games each week, each one became a high-stakes event. The syndicates thrived on the combination of scarcity and spectacle. In smoky back rooms across the country, bookmakers tuned in to the same broadcasts as families and fans. They kept ledgers open beside the television, phones ringing as bets came in. Each drive, each penalty, each missed tackle carried weight far beyond the field. In those rooms, football was no longer a sport. It was arithmetic. It was a transaction of faith between strangers, enforced by muscle and fear. The beauty of the game was stripped to numbers, and the mob treated those numbers like assets. The players, meanwhile, found themselves living to realities. On the field, they were symbols of strength and honor. Off it, they faced a culture where rumors spread faster than truth. A simple conversation with the wrong person could invite suspicion. The glare of television lights meant there was nowhere to hide. Every handshake and every photograph could become evidence in the eyes of the public. Some began avoiding public appearances altogether, fearful of being caught in the wrong frame or context. For the league's leadership, television created both opportunity and anxiety. Commissioner Bert Bell understood the value of visibility, but knew too well the fragility of reputation. He believed that if the public ever doubted the honesty of the game, no broadcast deal or championship could repair the damage. Bell's office worked tirelessly to distance the NFL from even the perception of gambling influence. His speeches stressed integrity and honor, while behind the scenes, investigators gathered intelligence on suspicious activity around games. It was a campaign fought on two fronts: to grow the game and to keep its soul intact. Yet television blurred those boundaries in ways the league could not always control. Networks began marketing players as celebrities, focusing on personalities as much as performance. Stardom, once rare in football, became common. With fame came attention from every kind of admirer, including those who saw profit in proximity. Invitations to events, offers of endorsement deals, and friendly meetings often came with hidden motives. The fame that made the NFL a national obsession also made it a target. As the 1950s closed, the league found itself walking a narrow line between prosperity and peril. Television had transformed football into America's favorite spectacle, but it also made the game more transparent than ever. Fans could now see the joy and agony of every play. The exhaustion on a lineman's face, the frustration of a missed pass. That intimacy built loyalty, but it also made scandal feel personal. A game tainted by corruption would not just disappoint fans, it would betray them. The irony was clear. The very technology that promised to legitimize the NFL also exposed it to new vulnerabilities. Every camera angle captured triumph and temptation in equal measure. Every broadcast expanded both the audience and the appetite for risk. The game that once belonged to neighborhoods now belonged to the nation, and the nation was learning that purity was hard to preserve when money multiplied so fast. Television made heroes of ordinary men and turned those men into targets for forces they could not always see. The mob understood spectacle better than anyone. It knew that where there were fans, there were bets. And where there were bets, there was control. The league's success became the mob's opportunity. And as the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, the lines between entertainment, business, and vice grew thinner than ever before. The winter of 1958 delivered a football game that would come to define an era. It was called the greatest game ever played, the NFL championship between the New York Giants and the Baltimore Colts. That afternoon in Yankee Stadium, beneath the frozen breath of December air, the league changed forever. What most Americans saw was the birth of modern professional football. What some insiders knew was that it was also a test of the league's integrity, taking place under the shadow of quiet suspicion. The build-up to that game carried the energy of something larger than sport. Television cameras lined the stadium, broadcasting live to millions across the country. It was the first championship to reach that many homes at once. The league hoped the spectacle would cement football as America's game. But not everyone watching cared about touchdowns. Behind the spectacle, bookmakers were setting lines with precision, and money flowed from Chicago to New York in record sums. The championship had become a national betting event. Rumors had circulated that season about unusual betting activity surrounding key games. Odds moved quickly in the days before kickoff, and insiders whispered that someone somewhere had information. Others did not. The Giants, a team built on discipline and structure, had played unevenly through December. The Colts, led by Johnny Unitas, represented something new: confidence, charisma, and a passing attack that defined the future. The contrast between order and chaos, old guard and new blood, mirrored the hidden tension behind the sport's clean surface. Those who worked close to the betting world saw familiar patterns. Lines shifted sharply hours before the game, reflecting a surge of late money on the Colts. Syndicates had their reasons, and not all were based on sports analysis. Some claimed they had heard about injuries before the press did. Others believed referees had been approached, though no proof ever surfaced. What remained constant was that the volume of wagers exceeded anything the league had seen before. For gamblers and the mob networks behind them, football had officially replaced baseball as the preferred field of play. Inside the league office, Commissioner Burt Bell understood the danger. He knew that too much talk about gambling could stain what should have been a triumph. The NFL was entering a new age of popularity, and scandal was the one threat that could halt its rise. So the league ignored the whispers. There were no public investigations, no statements, no questions about the money moving quietly through the underground. The message was clear: focus on the game. Protect the image. Keep the noise outside the stadium walls. That afternoon, the game unfolded in a way that felt almost cinematic. The Colts took an early lead, the Giants fought back, and the crowd swayed between agony and joy. Every play seemed charged with meaning. When Unitas led the final drive to force overtime, millions watched in disbelief. It was the first overtime game in championship history, the kind of drama that executives dreamed of. The Colts' sudden death victory would become legend. But for those tracking numbers and payouts, the ending carried another kind of significance. The point spread had hovered at 3.5 in favor of the Colts. The final score was 23-17. Baltimore covered the spread. The result delighted gamblers who had backed the favorite and fed suspicions that the flow of money had been too neatly aligned with the outcome. There was no evidence of wrongdoing, no witness testimony, only the coincidence of numbers that fit too well. To the public, it was destiny. To those who watched the margins, it was something else entirely. After the final whistle, confetti fell, and the league celebrated what it called its greatest moment. The cameras captured smiling players, the handshake between coaches, and the image of Unitas standing in the cold as a national hero. Yet somewhere beneath the euphoria, questions lingered. Why had the betting lines moved so sharply? Who had placed the largest wagers, and how did they know what they knew? The answers, if they existed, remained buried in the ledgers of bookmakers who never spoke publicly. In the months that followed, football entered its television age with renewed vigor. The 1958 championship was credited with transforming the sport from a regional pastime into a national phenomenon. Networks expanded coverage, advertisers lined up, and fans multiplied. The league had achieved what it had long sought: legitimacy and mass appeal. But the cost of that success was invisibility for the forces that profited quietly in the background. The NFL had grown too valuable to risk by exposing its underworld connections. Silence was safety. Many who played in that game never forgot the feeling of being watched. Some spoke later about men in tailored coats standing near the sidelines, always present but never acknowledged. They were not team staff or journalists, yet they moved with confidence, as if they belonged. For the players, it became a symbol of the era, the unspoken understanding that someone, somewhere, always had a stake. Every touchdown meant more than victory. It meant money changing hands in places they would never see. For organized crime, 1958 confirmed what they already knew. The NFL was no longer an obscure league struggling for attention. It was the country's new obsession, and with that obsession came endless opportunity. Betting houses expanded, new communication lines opened, and the industry of sports gambling matured with startling efficiency. The mob did not need to fix games to profit. All it needed was access to information, control of odds, and the ability to manipulate public sentiment through rumor. Football's unpredictability became its greatest asset. Behind closed doors, league officials debated how to manage the growing relationship between popularity and risk. They knew that, as the sport grew, so did temptation. Player salaries still lagged behind the wealth circulating around the league. That imbalance was dangerous. The possibility that a player might be compromised was no longer theoretical. It was structural. The very system that made the NFL successful also made it vulnerable. The 1958 championship was the perfect paradox. It elevated the game into American culture's heart while deepening the shadows beneath it. Every great story of triumph needs tension, and the NFL's came from the quiet battle for integrity fought behind the scenes. To fans, the league looked stronger than ever. To insiders, it was entering a new phase of exposure, where every camera flash could reveal either glory or guilt. As decades passed, the 1958 game would be remembered for changing everything about how America watched football. Few remembered the unease that lingered in its wake. It was a night of celebration, built on a foundation of suspicion. A reminder that even in moments of perfection, truth often hides in silence. The NFL had found its soul on television, but it had also found its reflection in the eyes of those who bet against it. And in those eyes, the game was never pure. By the late 1950s, the National Football League could no longer rely on quiet denials or backroom assurances to keep gambling out of its bloodstream. The whispers had grown into something tangible. Point spreads were published in newspapers. Local bookmakers operated with near impunity. And every time a player fumbled a ball or missed a tackle, someone in a crowded barroom swore it was fixed. Commissioner Bert Bell, a former coach and owner turned moral guardian, realized that words were no longer enough. The league needed enforcement. It needed policing. Needed to look into its own shadow. Bell's campaign began not with public grandstanding, but with private letters. He wrote to every team, every coach, every front office executive, warning them that gambling was not just a legal threat, but an existential one. He called it the league's greatest enemy, a force that could unravel decades of effort in a single scandal. To Bell, football's power came from the belief that what happened on the field was pure competition. If that trust vanished, the entire sport would collapse under its own doubt. Behind his warnings lay a network of quiet investigations. Bell ordered league officials to gather information on suspicious figures seen near players. He coordinated with law enforcement agencies to track known bookmakers who frequented team hotels or training camps. There was no central database, no federal oversight, only a patchwork of files and human memory. Yet these efforts marked the beginning of an internal system of accountability, one that would later evolve into the NFL's modern security apparatus. Bell's background made him uniquely suited for this role. He had been around long enough to know how temptation worked. As the owner of the Philadelphia Eagles, he had seen players struggle with debts and backroom offers. As commissioner, he understood that gambling was not just an external threat, but an internal weakness, exploiting pride, poverty, and vulnerability. His vision of policing was not simply about catching criminals. It was about protecting players from themselves, from the loneliness and pressure that made a wager seem like a way to feel control in a world ruled by chance. The early enforcement measures were primitive. Bell empowered a small group of trusted investigators to travel between cities, quietly interviewing bartenders, hotel managers, and stadium staff. They looked for patterns, for men who always seemed to be present when betting lines shifted. The league issued memos to all teams. Report any contact with suspected gamblers, no matter how trivial. Players were told to avoid accepting gifts, free meals, or even casual friendships with anyone tied to bookmaking. The memo carried a chilling weight. It implied that the line between innocence and guilt could blur in a single conversation. The policy was controversial. Some players felt insulted by the implication that they might be corrupted. Others saw it as necessary discipline. Many understood that professional football was becoming too valuable to risk. Television was turning athletes into household names, and that fame carried a cost. For Bell, the greater danger was complacency. He warned that success would make the league soft, that moral vigilance had to grow with the money. In 1956, the commissioner faced his first major test when rumors surfaced about a possible connection between a coach and a known gambler. The evidence was weak, but Bell treated it as a symbol of how close the league had come to disaster. He convened a meeting of owners and laid out a stark message. One scandal, one confirmed case of fixing, could destroy the NFL. The owners listened, some reluctantly, others with quiet fear. They understood that their league's survival depended on invisible policing, on trust sustained by constant scrutiny. Bell's strategy extended beyond punishment. He sought to build a culture of transparency. Players were urged to report any suspicious approach immediately. Team officials were required to document irregularities, from betting rumors to anonymous phone calls. The league began working with newspapers, urging them to avoid printing betting lines that could feed the underworld economy. It was an uphill battle. Gambling was deeply rooted in American life, and football's growing popularity made it an irresistible magnet for wagers. Yet Bell persisted, often at personal cost. His health was failing, but he refused to slow down. He wrote speeches warning of what he called the moral erosion that begins with small excuses. He believed that corruption did not enter the sport through greed alone. It entered through fatigue, through small compromises made in the name of convenience. His message to players was simple: every choice, every friendship, every secret mattered. The integrity of the game was not protected by laws or contracts, but by individual conscience. The commissioner's warnings grew louder as betting became more sophisticated. Mob-backed bookmakers used coded phone calls and middlemen to conceal transactions. The money moved faster than the investigators could follow. Law enforcement agencies struggled to trace the flow because much of it was cash, exchanged hand-to-hand in smoky bars or hotel rooms. Bell understood that the league's reach ended where legality began. He could threaten suspensions, but he could not arrest criminals. His power was moral, not judicial. Still, his leadership gave the NFL something it had never possessed before: an identity built on integrity. The message resonated in locker rooms across the country. Younger players began to see gambling not as a harmless vice, but as a betrayal of the team. Coaches enforced curfews, limited access to outsiders, and reinforced the idea that the game was sacred. This shift in mentality was slow, uneven, and sometimes hypocritical. But it laid the foundation for future decades of vigilance. When Bell collapsed and died during a game in 1959, the league mourned more than a commissioner. It mourned its conscience. In the years that followed, the policies he established became institutional doctrine. New commissioners expanded the enforcement system, hiring former FBI agents and detectives to maintain surveillance. The files grew thicker. The walls between players and the gambling world grew higher. But the core principle remained Bell's, that a single act of corruption could destroy the public's faith forever. His legacy was not perfect. Critics argued that his strict approach created paranoia, that it treated suspicion as guilt. But even they acknowledged that his methods saved the league from self-destruction. Without Bell's relentless insistence on moral clarity, the NFL might have followed the same path as boxing, a sport once glorious but ultimately consumed by scandal. By the time the 1960s arrived, football had transformed from a regional pastime into a national spectacle. The shadow Bell had warned of never fully disappeared, but it was kept at bay by the structures he built. His final years had proven that the most dangerous threats were not on the field but around it, waiting for a moment of weakness. Bell's words lingered long after his death. Gambling, he said, was not the league's enemy because of money or legality. It was the enemy because it preyed on trust. And trust was the lifeblood of sport, the invisible thread binding players, fans, and institutions together. Once broken, it could never be restored. The NFL's first formal anti-gambling enforcement programs were born from that belief. They were imperfect, sometimes unfair, but necessary. They turned fear into policy, policy into culture, and culture into endurance. In the years ahead, new leaders would take Bell's vision further, creating a league that watched itself more closely than any outside authority ever could. The shadow never vanished. It only changed shape, hiding behind television contracts, player endorsements, and the expanding world of sports betting that would one day re-emerge in full force. But for a time, Bell's vigilance gave the league breathing room, a fragile piece bought by caution and moral discipline. The fight to preserve integrity was never truly won, but it was kept alive by men who understood that the game's purity was its only real defense. In the 1950s, the truth about gambling in professional football did not just live in smoky betting parlors or backroom meetings. It also lived quietly in the notebooks of reporters. They were the unseen witnesses, the chroniclers who stood at the edge of revelation, balancing what they knew with what they could never print. The story of organized gambling and the NFL's shadow dealings was not entirely hidden from the press, was merely softened, trimmed, and shaped into silence by men who understood both the power and the cost of words. Sports writers of that era were not just journalists. They were companions to the teams. They rode the same trains, stayed in the same hotels, and shared meals with the players they covered. The line between friendship and professional distance was thin, often invisible. Many of them had come from a generation that believed in protecting the sport's image, not exposing its flaws. Their loyalty was to the game itself, to the myth of clean competition, not to the uncomfortable truths that could fracture public trust. Behind the scenes, the rumors were constant. Writers heard whispers of point spreads that seemed too accurate, of strange visitors lingering near locker rooms, of players under quiet financial strain. They listened as barroom sources spoke of games that drew suspicious betting spikes hours before kickoff. Most of them took notes, filed them away, and said nothing. The silence was not always corruption. Sometimes it was fear. Newspapers depended on access. The teams controlled that access. A single story that hinted at scandal could end a career overnight. Editors understood the fragility of relationships with sports leagues, and publishers knew that controversy could drive advertisers away. The idea of investigative sports journalism was still young, and moral courage was a luxury few could afford. In the post-war years, when America sought heroes rather than scandals, editors often chose to preserve illusions. There were exceptions. Some reporters tried to break through the code of silence. A few wrote cautious columns about the dangers of gambling's influence, hinting at unnamed sources and suspicious trends. But even they faced pressure. Letters from team owners would arrive at newspaper offices, warning that access would be revoked. Coaches would stop returning calls. Players who had once shared jokes on train rides would become distant. A journalist who spoke too loudly risked becoming an outsider, exiled from the very world he was trying to protect. Ethically, the dilemma cut deep. Many journalists believed their role was to defend the game's integrity by not allowing rumors to destroy it. Others argued that truth was the only defense worth having. This divide split press boxes across the country. Some reporters felt that exposing corruption would purify the sport. Others feared it would kill it. The result was a kind of uneasy truce, a shared understanding that certain stories would remain unwritten. In private conversations, some journalists admitted they felt complicit. They watched the league grow richer and more powerful, aware that part of its strength came from the perception of purity they helped maintain. They told themselves they were preserving something sacred, but in quiet moments, they wondered if they were protecting something fragile instead. The tension between truth and loyalty became an emotional burden that few spoke about publicly. The moral atmosphere of 1950s journalism was shaped by patriotism and optimism. The war had ended, television was rising, and the American public craved stories of victory and virtue. Scandals were not just bad for business, they were seen as unpatriotic. Sports writers carried this cultural weight. To accuse a team of corruption was, in some eyes, to accuse the nation of weakness. The press became the gatekeeper of faith, holding back what it feared the public could not bear to know. A handful of investigative reporters challenged that view. Some dug into the networks of bookmakers who seemed to move in step with team travel schedules. They traced betting lines that shifted mysteriously, following patterns that pointed toward inside information. But without proof, they had little to print. The mob's operations were well protected. No journalist wanted to accuse a player without evidence. In an era before recordings, subpoenas, and leaks, rumors died for lack of documentation. Even when reporters stumbled upon fragments of truth, their editors often stopped them. One journalist recalled submitting a column suggesting that league officials were quietly meeting with law enforcement to discuss betting syndicates. The story was cut, rewritten, and eventually shelved. The editor told him that football was too important to be damaged by speculation. The young writer never forgot that moment. He realized that journalism's highest principle, truth, could be sacrificed on the altar of reputation. Still, the press was not entirely silent. Columns about the dangers of gambling began appearing with cautious regularity. They were written in general terms, warning of temptation and moral decline, rarely naming names. These articles served as signals, reminders that not everyone was blind. But they also reflected the limits of courage. Writers wanted to warn without accusing, to protect without confronting. The result was journalism that hovered between honesty and restraint. Privately, many of those same journalists carried guilt. They watched as the league expanded, its public image untouched by the corruption it fought behind closed doors. They wondered if their silence had allowed the rot to spread. Some confessed years later that they had known more than they ever printed. They had names, locations, even letters. But they also had families to feed, careers to protect, and a deep sense of belonging to the world they covered. The emotional toll was profound. For the men who loved the game, the choice between truth and loyalty was not simple. To expose corruption was to destroy something they cherished. To remain silent was to betray their duty as journalists. This conflict created an invisible fraternity of regret, a generation of reporters who carried the weight of what they could not say. As television transformed sports coverage, new pressures emerged. Networks paid enormous sums for broadcast rights, and with that money came an unspoken rule: protect the product. Journalists who appeared on air were expected to maintain the image of professionalism and excitement, not skepticism. The divide between entertainment and truth grew wider. For the first time, football coverage became part of the business it was supposed to watch. Objectivity gave way to partnership. By the end of the decade, the culture of silence had become institutional. It was not simply cowardice, it was habit. The league and the media existed in a mutual pact. The NFL provided access, stories, and spectacle. The press provided reverence, attention, and protection. Both sides benefited, and both lost something in the process. In later years, as investigative journalism matured, the old guard would look back on the 1950s with mixed feelings. Some defended their restraint as responsible stewardship. Others called it moral failure. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. Those journalists were products of their time, bound by cultural expectations that valued harmony over exposure. Yet even within those limits, a few voices dared to question. To write cautiously but persistently about the dangers of unchecked power. Their warnings, however muted, planted seeds. The idea that the press could hold sports accountable did not vanish. It merely waited for a generation unafraid to confront what their predecessors could only hint at. The journalists of the 1950s lived in a world where silence was considered virtue, and where loyalty was both armor and chain. Their story is one of conscience, of men who stood between truth and survival. Some chose to protect the game. Others quietly preserved the facts for a time when the world was ready to listen. Both paid a price. The press rooms of that era smelled of ink, sweat, and restraint. Every unprinted line carried the ghost of a decision. Every quiet nod between a writer and an editor marked another moment when history was allowed to sleep. In the end, the journalists who knew did not simply fail to tell the story. They became part of it. Their silence became a form of authorship, shaping how the public understood integrity and illusion. And while their restraint preserved football's golden image, it also ensured that truth would one day return with greater force, demanding to be heard. In every era of sport, there are stories that live longer than the games themselves. In the NFL of the 1950s, one such story whispered through locker rooms, press boxes, and corner bars. It was the rumor of a fixed game, a contest said to have been shaped not by talent or strategy, but by invisible hands pulling strings for profit. No one could ever prove it, and perhaps no one truly wanted to. But the echo of that rumor lingered for decades, becoming part of the league's uneasy folklore. The story began, as many do, in fragments. A sudden shift in betting lines. A fumble that seemed too convenient. A player whose performance dropped without explanation. None of it could stand as evidence. Yet the pattern felt deliberate to those who watched closely. Bookmakers in Chicago and New York claimed to have inside knowledge of how the game would unfold. A few made fortunes. Others lost everything. The truth was buried beneath the noise. Leaving behind a question that refused to die. Was one of the NFL's proudest Sundays quietly bought and sold? The rumor did not name names at first. It spread in the way secrets always do, passed from one insider to another, reshaped by retelling. Some said the fix came from desperate players who needed quick money. Others believed it was orchestrated by organized crime figures looking to test their reach inside a growing league. In the 1950s, when salaries were meager and oversight was loose, both explanations seemed possible. The NFL's leaders, aware of how fragile public trust remained, chose silence. What made this alleged fix so haunting was not what was known, but what was never confirmed. The evidence was circumstantial. The timelines conflicted. Witnesses recanted or disappeared. Reporters who pursued the story found themselves chasing smoke. A few came close to publishing exposes, but without hard proof, their editors refused to risk it. The result was a vacuum filled by imagination, and in that space, myth took root. Over time, the legend of the fixed game became more powerful than any verified truth. Fans debated it for years, tracing back through old box scores, analyzing grainy footage, comparing suspicious plays. Some swore they could see hesitation in a lineman's step, or confusion in a quarterback's read. Others dismissed it all as coincidence. The game, they argued, had simply reflected human error, not manipulation. But once doubt enters a story, it never truly leaves. The culture of secrecy surrounding the league only deepened the mystery. The NFL of the 1950s guarded its image with near-religious intensity. Admitting that even one game might have been compromised would have shaken the foundation of its integrity campaign. This was an era when gambling was treated as moral contagion, capable of destroying reputations overnight. To protect itself, the league denied rumors before they could form sentences. In hindsight, the story of the fix that never was says as much about the nation as it does about football. Post-war America wanted to believe in fair play. The country's heroes were soldiers, workers, and athletes who embodied effort and virtue. The idea that something as pure as a football game could be tainted by corruption struck too close to home. So the rumor lived on in the margins, too threatening to confirm, too persistent to erase. The few surviving participants from that era spoke cautiously when asked about it decades later. Some laughed it off as urban legend. Others admitted that strange things happened, but offered no details. One retired coach hinted that he had once received a phone call warning him about players being approached by gamblers. He said he ignored it, not wanting to believe it could be true. Years later, he wondered if his denial had been part of the problem. In truth, what gave the rumor its power was not evidence, but emotion. It reflected the public's lingering suspicion that success and honesty rarely travel together. Every generation of fans has its version of the story. The one game that seemed too suspicious. The one result that defied logic. The 1950s fix became a vessel for that anxiety, a way to express the fear that the sport might not always be what it seemed. The psychology of conspiracy thrives where transparency fails. In the early NFL, record-keeping was limited. Investigations were private, and communication between teams and the league office was inconsistent. This allowed myths to flourish unchecked. The more the league denied, the more convincing the rumor became. In a strange way, the absence of proof was treated as proof itself. Scholars who studied the period later found no definitive evidence that the alleged game was fixed. Yet the story had already transcended fact. It became an archetype, a reminder that even the cleanest sports could cast long shadows. The power of the rumor lay not in what it proved, but in what it suggested that every moment of triumph carried a hidden cost. Every celebration a potential secret. What made the legend endure was its adaptability. It fit any decade, any scandal, any player who fell from grace. Whenever a modern controversy surfaced, journalists and fans reached back to the 1950s fix as a reference point. It became the foundation for distrust, a parable about temptation and denial. The NFL's public success only amplified it. The brighter the spotlight, the darker the shadow appeared. There is a peculiar comfort in believing that something might have gone wrong long ago. It allows the present to feel cleaner by comparison. For many, the 1950s fix became that necessary myth. It turned corruption into cautionary folklore, reminded fans and players alike that purity is never permanent. The rumor's endurance proved its utility. It was less about uncovering truth than preserving vigilance. The league eventually addressed the story in measured tones, acknowledging that it had heard the accusations but found no basis for them. Its official stance was firm. No evidence of game fixing existed in the NFL's history, but the phrasing itself seemed to invite interpretation. Absence of evidence did not erase imagination. The fix that never was continued to live in the spaces between sentences. For historians, the episode offers a study in how sports mythology evolves. Myths emerge not from lies, but from uncertainty. When institutions refuse to reveal their secrets, the public writes its own version of events. The NFL's silence became the soil from which rumor grew, and once grown, it could not be uprooted. The real story of the alleged fix may have been simple human failure. A tired player, a misread play, a turnover at the worst possible time. But humans crave patterns and meaning, especially in competition. We want to believe that outcomes reflect intention, not randomness. The rumor satisfied that need by offering an explanation more thrilling than chance. Over the years, documentaries, novels, and whispered retellings all revisited the tale. Each added new details, some invented, some misremembered, some perhaps real. By the time modern historians examined it, the story had become too entangled to separate truth from legend. It had evolved into something larger than any evidence could contain. A cautionary ghost haunting the league's golden age. Perhaps that is why it matters. The fix that never was serves as a mirror for the NFL's moral struggle. It reveals the league's fear of exposure, the players' vulnerability, and the public's hunger for purity. It is not the confirmation of corruption that defines this chapter, but the persistence of doubt. In the end, the story of that unproven fix stands as an emblem of what the 1950s NFL truly faced. Not a singular crime, but a culture of secrecy that allowed suspicion to thrive. The league learned that silence can be as corrosive as guilt. And the fans learned that even when every game ends, the stories around it never truly do. The fix that never was remains what it has always been, a haunting possibility. An unanswered question, a legend that binds truth and imagination in uneasy alliance. It reminds us that in every era, the integrity of sport rests not only on rules and referees, but on faith. And faith, once shaken, is never fully restored. By the time the 1960s arrived, the face of America's vices was changing. The mob's grip was loosening. Not because they were losing interest, but because the country itself was becoming more open about what it once tried to hide. Gambling, once whispered in smoke-filled rooms and exchanged in coded language, was beginning to take on a new, almost patriotic form of entertainment. And nowhere was this transformation more visible than in the desert city of Las Vegas. What began as a dusty outlaw outpost was now becoming the bright, unashamed capital of risk. Neon lights replaced the shadows of alleyways. Casinos were legitimized with government oversight. And the same thrill that had once fueled backroom bets on NFL games was now being sold as spectacle. Las Vegas had a strange relationship with sports. It was both admirer and predator. The city didn't need to fix games anymore. It only needed the illusion of proximity. The NFL, for its part, watched carefully from a distance, fearing what it could not fully control. League officials knew that gambling was a virus of perception. Once the public believed a game might be compromised, Even once, the entire sport's legitimacy could collapse overnight. The NFL's power relied not just on athletes or coaches, but on the illusion that every down was fought with pure intention. In the 1960s, that illusion was worth more than gold. Vegas had grown out of the same forces the league feared most: ambition, greed, and the need to escape. The mob had built its foundations, but the new Las Vegas of the mid-century was entering its corporate phase. Bankers, hotel chains, and Wall Street money replaced gangsters and gunmen. Betting became sanitized, wrapped in glitz, and backed by investors who wore suits instead of scars. Yet the connection to football never faded. The NFL was still the ultimate prize, the most watched, most bet-in sport in America. The league could not embrace Vegas without risking everything it had fought to protect. But it also couldn't ignore it. Behind closed doors, executives discussed it often. The 1963 scandal involving Paul Hornung and Alex Karras, both suspended for betting on games, was a public warning shot. The league drew a bright line. Gambling would remain the enemy. Commissioner Pete Rozelle, newly in power, saw himself as the guardian of moral integrity. He moved swiftly, setting the tone for decades of policy that would define how the NFL interacted with money, temptation, and control. To Rozelle, Las Vegas was not a city. It was a symbol of corruption's persistence. But the irony was that the NFL was growing in the same direction Vegas was. Television was making games more accessible. Advertisers were pouring in, and stadiums were becoming stages. The sport was evolving into a show, and Vegas was the capital of shows. Both were in the business of selling excitement, the feeling of suspense that something could turn at any moment. And beneath the spectacle, both were gambling operations in spirit. The difference was that one called it entertainment and the other called it a business. As the 1960s moved forward, Vegas transformed from outlaw city to mainstream attraction. Celebrities filled hotel lounges. Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack gave the town legitimacy. Tourists came not for the danger, but for the promise of risk without consequence. Yet, for all its glitz, the NFL's old fear never disappeared. League officials were still haunted by the question of whether the sport could ever be completely free of influence. For every decade that passed, stories would surface, whispers of odd calls, suspicious point spreads, unexplained collapses. Nothing was ever proven, but perception had a way of lasting longer than evidence. Vegas, meanwhile, began studying the NFL like a mathematician studying probability. Bookmakers no longer operated in shadows. They became analysts, experts, and entrepreneurs. The birth of the sportsbook era gave rise to a new kind of statistician. Every play, every injury, every weather report became a variable in the equation of chance. The mob no longer needed to threaten a quarterback or a ref. The real money was in prediction, not manipulation. Vegas understood that better than anyone. By the end of the decade, the NFL had become America's favorite gamble, even if it officially pretended not to be. Fans wagered casually in offices, bars, and living rooms. The league turned a blind eye as long as it stayed underground. Publicly, it condemned betting. Privately, it enjoyed the attention it brought. Television networks found that games were more exciting when something was at stake. Ratings grew. Advertising soared. The line between gambling and fandom blurred quietly, without anyone having to say it out loud. When the first major sportsbooks began posting point spreads for NFL games in Las Vegas, the league responded with outrage. Yet the numbers kept coming. Fans were drawn to them instinctively. A team was no longer just a team. It was a statistical entity with odds and implications. Every field goal mattered. Every touchdown carried economic weight. It changed the way people watched. It made the NFL more suspenseful, more dramatic, and, paradoxically, more profitable. Las Vegas didn't need the NFL's approval to win. It had already absorbed the spirit of the game. Competition mixed with risk. The city's rise coincided perfectly with the league's television explosion. Both sold the same emotional product, uncertainty. Every Sunday in America, millions of viewers placed faith in teams they could not control. Every night in Vegas, gamblers did the same with cards and dice. The language of odds and outcomes united them, whether they admitted it or not. The NFL tried to maintain moral distance, but it couldn't ignore that its future was moving in the same direction. Corporate America was learning to monetize unpredictability. The league was building franchises worth millions, television deals worth billions, and merchandising empires beyond calculation. Every decision became a kind of bet. And as the league grew, so did the stakes. By the early 1970s, the NFL had become too big to fail, but also too big to pretend innocence. For Las Vegas, it was never personal. The city had always been a mirror, reflecting what America really wanted. Beneath the glitz was a deeper truth, the desire for control over chaos. Betting was not just about money, 'twas about belief, the belief that knowledge could conquer uncertainty. In that way, football and gambling were siblings, born of the same national obsession. Both promised clarity in a world ruled by chance. When the mob finally lost its monopoly on gambling, Vegas didn't lose its edge. It reinvented it. Casinos became entertainment empires. The city turned itself into a brand. And as the mob receded, the corporations arrived, bringing with them legitimacy, insurance, and television deals. The NFL watched as the city evolved from a shadow threat into a potential partner. But it wasn't ready yet. The past was still too close. The league's officials had long memories, and the ghosts of the 1940s and 1950s still lingered. Yet the tide of culture was shifting. America was learning to live with its vices rather than deny them. The idea of betting wasn't taboo anymore. It was mathematics wrapped in showmanship. The mob's brutality had been replaced by algorithms. The same thrill that once came from breaking rules was now available through sanctioned, televised risk. The NFL, still guarding its image, couldn't see it yet, but the groundwork was being laid for a future where gambling and football would not just coexist, they would be inseparable. Vegas didn't destroy the mob's legacy. It absorbed it, refined it, and sold it back to the public as entertainment. The NFL, whether it liked it or not, was next in line for that transformation. The league had spent decades trying to distance itself from corruption, yet it was building a culture that thrived on the same impulses. As the desert city glowed brighter, the league's moral boundaries dimmed. In time, Las Vegas would no longer be the enemy. It would become part of the empire. But for now, in the 1960s, the fear still lingered. The fear that the old ghosts might return, not through crime, but through acceptance. The NFL could no longer pretend that gambling lived outside its walls. The truth was simpler and more unsettling. It lived in the same place it always had, in the human desire to make meaning out of chance. As the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, the National Football League stood at a crossroads. The league had conquered the airwaves, expanded across cities, and turned the sport into an American ritual. Yet beneath the triumph, there was an anxiety that refused to fade. The NFL's rise had been shadowed by its past, by whispers of fixed games, by the ghosts of gamblers and the fear that the public might one day lose faith in the fairness of the contest. Reputation was everything. Without it, even the most spectacular touchdown meant nothing. And so the league began to build its next great legacy, the illusion of purity. Commissioner Pete Rozelle understood the stakes. He believed that the NFL's future depended not only on athletic greatness, but on the perception of moral strength. He treated integrity as a currency, as vital as the television contracts that funded the sport's expansion. Under his leadership, the league became less a collection of teams and more a unified institution, disciplined, polished, and controlled. Scandals would be met, not with quiet tolerance, but with public punishment. Rules would be codified into a doctrine, and that doctrine would become gospel. The suspensions of Paul Hornung and Alex Karras for gambling had already made a statement. No one, not even stars, would be spared. But Rozelle went further. He created an environment of strict oversight, mandating that every employee, from referees to owners, understood the gravity of betting connections. The policy was absolute. No association with gamblers, no casual wagers, no ambiguity. The league's integrity office began keeping quiet files, investigating whispers before they became headlines. Players were reminded that they were not just athletes, but ambassadors of a moral code. This new order did not come cheaply. It cost the league freedom, spontaneity, and at times, authenticity. Players lived under surveillance, aware that even offhand remarks could raise suspicion. The NFL's growing wealth made temptation more dangerous, not less. Every endorsement deal, every sponsorship, was scrutinized for potential conflicts. What had once been a sport defined by raw competition was now a business bound by reputation management. Yet, it worked. The NFL's image began to harden into something powerful, a symbol of clean American competition. Free of scandal and corruption. Fans bought into the narrative. They needed to believe in the league's purity as much as the league needed them to. In an era when other sports faltered under controversy, the NFL rose above, projecting a sense of order and discipline. Baseball had its steroid rumors. Boxing had its fixed fights. College athletics struggled with underthattle payments. But the NFL stood apart, untouched, self-righteous in its morality. That confidence became its greatest strength, and, in time, its quiet vulnerability. For players, the rules were both protection and burden. The price of fame was obedience. A man could be celebrated on Sunday and erased by Monday if his actions threatened the shield. Rozelle's regime turned the NFL into a moral hierarchy, where appearances mattered as much as truth. Players learned to police themselves, to keep their circles small, their words careful. Reporters who probed too deeply were met with polite resistance. The league's official story was the only story that mattered. Behind the scenes, however, redemption became a quiet theme. The league understood that even its harshest punishments needed to lead somewhere. Hornung and Karras were both reinstated after a year, their return treated as symbolic proof that integrity could be restored. The message was clear. Sin could be forgiven, but only after submission. The NFL had mastered the art of moral theater. Each scandal, real or perceived, was followed by a public act of cleansing. Every punishment reinforced the idea that the system worked. Yet the tighter the league controlled its image, the more fragile it became. Players began to feel that perfection was a performance, not a truth. The expectation of spotless conduct created quiet resentment. Many knew that human flaws didn't vanish simply because the league forbade them. Drinking, gambling, and personal struggles persisted, hidden beneath the surface. What mattered was not whether they occurred, but whether they were discovered. In time, the NFL's obsession with purity became its own kind of hypocrisy, a necessary illusion to keep the machine running. For Rozelle and his successors, the goal was not to make the league perfect, but to make it appear incorruptible. They understood that fans could forgive mistakes, but not betrayal. The NFL could survive violence, greed, and scandal, as long as it convinced the public that the competition itself remained honest. The field had to remain sacred. Every Sunday, when millions tuned in, they needed to believe that what they were watching was real, unscripted, and untainted. That belief was the foundation upon which billions of dollars rested. Throughout the 1970s, this reputation was tested repeatedly. The league's merger with the AFL brought new markets, new owners, and new levels of scrutiny. Television networks demanded transparency. Politicians sought regulation. But the NFL's control over its image remained absolute. When questions arose about officiating, they were met with polished press releases. When rumors of gambling connections surfaced, investigations were conducted quietly and concluded decisively. The result was always the same. The shield was intact. For players who had once lived through the uncertain, morally gray decades of the 1940s and 1950s, this transformation was staggering. They remembered locker rooms where bookies delivered envelopes and whispers traveled faster than passes. Now, that world was gone. The modern NFL was clean, structured, and distant. The men who played it were part of something bigger than themselves, bound not just by rules, but by a code of representation. They were the product, and their behavior defined its value. But with control came isolation. Many veterans felt the human spirit of the game slipping away. The league's strictness created distance between the players and the fans. The more it fought to appear flawless, the less relatable it became. The purity that protected the sport's reputation also sterilized it. Football had always thrived on rawness, the grit of imperfect men battling for meaning. Now, that rawness was contained, edited, and filtered through corporate polish. The game was still great, but its soul was changing. Yet redemption, in the truest sense, remained at the heart of the league's story. Every controversy became a lesson, every punishment an opportunity to rebuild. The NFL learned to turn moral crisis into narrative strength. The image of the repentant player returning to the field after exile became part of the mythology. It reassured fans that the league could correct itself, that, despite temptation and greed, the sport's essence remained pure. The public trusted not in perfection, but in the appearance of redemption. By the close of the 1970s, the NFL had done the impossible. It had buried its past without erasing it, crafting a legacy that celebrated both punishment and forgiveness. Rozell's policies created a blueprint for every commissioner that followed. They defined how the league would confront scandal swiftly, publicly, and always with the moral authority of an institution above reproach. The price of this power was authenticity, but the reward was immortality. Looking back, the era of reputation and redemption was about more than restoring public faith. It was about shaping what the NFL wanted to be, a mirror of American values. A story of progress through discipline, a promise that integrity could survive even in the face of profit. And though the league would face new storms in the decades to come, the lessons of that time would guide every decision. To be trusted, the NFL learned, was to be relentless. To be pure was to sacrifice truth for stability. And to be forgiven was to never stop reminding the world why forgiveness mattered. The NFL had rebuilt its image brick by brick, transforming fear into control, scandal into mythology. It had learned that redemption was not a single act, but an ongoing performance. A game played not on the field, but in the hearts of those who believed. And as long as that belief held, the league's empire would stand. Even as the decades moved forward, the shadow of gambling never truly left professional football. It lingered quietly in the locker rooms, in the commissioner's office, and in the minds of fans who remembered the rumors that once threatened to destroy the league. The lessons of the 1940s and 1950s had been absorbed into the DNA of the sport. Every new player, every coach, every executive entered a world built on the unspoken belief that integrity was fragile, and that one careless act could unravel everything. Fear became its own kind of discipline. The league had seen what corruption could do. It had watched other sports fall under suspicion, their records questioned and reputations shattered. For the NFL, that could never happen. By the 1960s, Commissioner Pete Rozell turned paranoia into policy. He treated gambling not as a vice, but as a virus. Every memo he wrote, every decision he made, carried the same message: protect the shield. Protect it from temptation, from scandal, and from itself. Rozell's fear was not of gamblers alone, but of the public losing faith in what they were watching. The NFL had become more than a sport. It was an idea. That idea was tested in 1963 when Paul Hornung of the Green Bay Packers and Alex Karras of the Detroit Lions were caught betting on football. Hornung was a golden boy, the face of Lombardi's dynasty, a man whose charm and skill seemed untouchable. Karras was a powerhouse, known for both his strength and his wit. When news broke that they had placed bets, the revelation hit the league like an earthquake. The timing was brutal. The NFL was at the height of its rise, becoming America's favorite game. And now the same fears that haunted the 1940s had returned in full color. Rozell's reaction was swift and absolute. Both men were suspended indefinitely. There were no negotiations, no appeals. The commissioner stood before the press and declared that the integrity of the game was non-negotiable. It was not anger that guided him, but a calculated demonstration of strength. The punishment was less about Horning and Karras themselves and more about what they represented. The message had to reach every player, every coach, every fan. The league would not allow the past to repeat itself. For Horning, the fall was public and painful. He was the golden figure of the Packers, a symbol of success under Lombardi's strict discipline. His suspension stripped him of that glory. He later admitted that Rozell had acted fairly and that the rules were clear. Karras, ever defiant, treated the suspension with a kind of humor, even returning to wrestling for a time to stay visible. But behind the bravado was the same truth. Gambling had cost them their place in the game they loved. Rozell reinstated both players a year later, but the damage had already done its work. Their cases became cautionary tales, replayed endlessly in training camps and locker rooms. Coaches spoke of them in hushed tones, as if invoking ghosts. The fear they inspired was precisely what Rozell wanted. It was a reminder that no one was above the law of the league. The legacy of those suspensions endured for decades. They became the moral foundation upon which every future gambling policy was built. Whenever a new scandal threatened, the NFL returned to 1963 as its compass, its justification for discipline. The lesson was simple. Gambling was the one sin the league could never tolerate. But fear, like tradition, can be both protector and poison. It preserved the league's image, but it also created a culture of silence. Players avoided conversations about gambling as if speaking the word itself was dangerous. Even legitimate discussions about sports betting were taboo. For years, broadcasters avoided mentioning point spreads, and journalists who covered betting lines were treated with suspicion. The NFL's fear had become part of its mythology. It gave the sport an aura of righteousness, but it also buried an honest conversation about the realities of temptation. Behind the scenes, Rozell's paranoia shaped everything from security protocols to press relations. Investigators quietly monitored players' associations, keeping records of any potential connections to known gamblers. Teams were instructed to report anything unusual, no matter how small. The league built a private intelligence network long before such oversight became common in sports. What had begun as reactive policy after decades of scandal became a permanent feature of the NFL's internal machinery. By the 1970s and 1980s, the shadow of gambling still hovered, even as the league entered its golden age. Television contracts soared. The Super Bowl became a national ritual. Yet, with every rise in visibility came a renewed sense of vigilance. Rozell's successors understood that public trust was the foundation of profitability. Every touchdown, every advertisement, every championship was underwritten by belief. The belief that what unfolded on the field was real and unscripted. In later years, the league faced new challenges that tested its moral compass in different ways. Substance abuse, player conduct, labor disputes, each issue carried echoes of that same legacy of fear. The NFL's instinct was always the same: control the narrative, contain the damage, and restore faith. In many ways, gambling had taught the league how to survive scandal. It had taught it the value of swift punishment, of public contrition followed by carefully managed redemption. Even as legal sports betting began to emerge across the country in the 21st century, the NFL's relationship with gambling remained uneasy. The old fear never truly disappeared. The league began to partner with betting companies and promote fantasy football. Yet the memory of the past lingered in every disclaimer, every policy statement, every press release that emphasized integrity. It was as if the league still carried the ghosts of the gamblers in trench coats who once paced the sidelines, signaling odds from the shadows. Modern players entered a league that seemed to have moved beyond the old scandals, but the lessons remained embedded in its culture. The Horning and Kara suspensions were still cited in training seminars. The NFL's integrity of the game policy remained one of the most stringent in professional sports. Even as technology made betting more accessible than ever, the message from the top stayed the same. The game must remain sacred. It is remarkable how fear, once born from scandal, evolved into faith. The league learned to channel its paranoia into protection. What began as reaction became tradition, and that tradition became strength. The same rules that once terrified players now reassured fans. They signaled that football, despite its commercial might, still valued something incorruptible. The lessons of the 1950s had not been forgotten. They had simply been rewritten into the modern code of conduct. For Rizal and the generations that followed, the legacy of fear was never about suppressing gambling alone. It was about controlling the narrative of trust. It was about ensuring that the public's love for the sport remained untouched by doubt. In that sense, fear had served its purpose. It had given the NFL a moral spine, a structure that could withstand controversy after controversy. But fear also demanded vigilance without end. The league's guardians learned that reputation must be defended every day, that the truth could never rest on assumption. The ghosts of the past whispered from every rulebook, from every fine, from every suspension that followed. They reminded the NFL that greatness could be lost in a single moment of weakness, and that redemption, while possible, was never guaranteed. As the modern game marched toward an era of unprecedented profit and global reach, the old lessons still mattered. The NFL's empire stood on the foundation of integrity. Built by those who had learned through scandal that reputation, once cracked, could never fully be repaired. The fear that once haunted the league had become its armor. It was both its burden and its salvation. The game had survived the whispers, the investigations, and the scandals. It had endured because it never forgot. Every rule, every safeguard, every warning carried a trace of those earlier decades, when the line between sport and corruption was perilously thin. The NFL's moral compass may have been forged in fear, but it guided the league toward permanence. The story of gambling in football was no longer just about crime or temptation. It was about vigilance and survival. The league had learned that to protect the game was to protect belief itself, belief that what happened on the field still meant something pure. And so the legacy of fear became a strange kind of strength, one that continues to define the NFL long after the gamblers left the shadows. Every empire carries its debts. Some are paid in money, others in memory. For the National Football League, the price of its rise was never measured only in television contracts or championship trophies. It was measured in the quiet guilt of a game that once walked too close to the edge. The ghosts of the 1950s never truly left. They still live in the cracks of the rulebook, in the commissioner's warnings, and in the nervous glances of those who know how easily the game could fall back into shadow. The debt that remains is not about money owed to bookmakers or bets uncollected. It is about moral reckoning, the cost of perfection built on imperfect men. The league was born in an era when trust was fragile. Every scandal, every rumor could topple the illusion of purity. It had fought through the 1946 scare, through whispers in the 1950s, through public humiliation in the 1960s. And yet the one truth that endured was this: the game would always exist in tension between purity and profit. Every new generation came with the same question, dressed in new words. Can a game built on risk ever be truly clean? Football itself is risk. Every play, every collision, every decision carries a wager. It is the one sport where danger is not a byproduct, but a principle. Men gamble with their bodies every Sunday. Coaches gamble on fourth downs and draft boards. Owners gamble on reputations, on markets, on the illusion of control. The very heartbeat of football is uncertainty, the same force that drives gamblers to chase impossible odds. The line between competition and corruption has always been paper thin. The NFL's fight to preserve integrity was never about erasing temptation. It was about managing it, hiding it beneath ritual, turning chaos into order. In the decades after the scandals, the league learned how to package morality into branding. Integrity became its product. The phrase "protect the shield" was not just a slogan, but a quiet confession of fear. It was the league's way of acknowledging that the ghosts were still there, watching from the stands. The players who once accepted cash under the table or turned blind eyes to fixers were replaced by men earning millions. But the temptation evolved rather than disappeared. The stakes were simply higher. By the 21st century, the irony had come full circle. The same league that once banished players for associating with gamblers now partnered with casinos and betting companies. Advertisements that would have been unthinkable in the days of Burt Bell or Pete Rozelle now filled stadium screens. The industry of gambling had been legalized, sanitized, and rebranded as entertainment. What was once crime became commerce. The NFL found itself standing once again in familiar territory. This time not as a victim of corruption, but as a participant in the business of risk. The league justified its new alliances with the language of regulation. It argued that legal betting was safer than the shadows of the past, that transparency would protect integrity rather than endanger it. And yet, beneath the surface, an old unease stirred. The question returned, unchanged by time. Can control coexist with temptation? Can the same institution that profits from wagers also promise purity? Those who remember the old stories know how fragile the line can be. The men of the 1950s had no idea they were building a myth that would outlive them. Their world was smaller, their choices more desperate. A $5,000 salary could buy a man's silence. Today's players make more in a quarter, yet the principle remains. Greed has no era. The currency may change, but the psychology of risk endures. The difference now is scale. Billions move through betting markets tied to every game, every statistic, every human mistake. The mob no longer needs to sit in the bleachers. The system runs itself. For the league, the challenge has shifted from denying gambling to managing it. Integrity departments have replaced private detectives. Algorithms track betting patterns once followed by bookies with notebooks and cigars. The surveillance is digital, the stakes infinite. Yet the danger remains human. As long as men compete for money and fame, there will be moments when temptation whispers louder than conscience. The NFL has spent decades trying to repay its moral debt, but debts of history rarely close. Every scandal that surfaces, no matter how small, feels like a tremor from the past. When a modern player is caught violating the league's gambling policy, the reaction is not just about the act itself, it is about the memory it awakens. It reminds the public that the story of corruption is not ancient history, but an ongoing negotiation between the purity of sport and the reality of commerce. And yet, despite the contradictions, football has endured because it tells the truth about who we are. It reflects the constant human struggle between ambition and restraint, between the love of the game and the hunger for gain. The mob may no longer control the betting lines, but the spirit of risk still defines the culture. Every fan who fills out a fantasy roster or places a legal wager participates, knowingly or not, in the same ancient ritual of chance that once drew gamblers into smoky backrooms. Perhaps that is the final irony. The league that once feared corruption now thrives on a version of it reimagined as engagement. Betting no longer threatens the game, it fuels it. The public that once condemned gambling as immoral now demands it as entertainment. The NFL, like the nation that shaped it, learned how to turn vice into value. But beneath the glow of legalized betting and billion-dollar partnerships, the echoes of the past still hum quietly. The difference between control and surrender is as narrow as it ever was. The men who built the modern league did not do so by erasing their mistakes, but by learning from them. Bert Bell's warnings about gambling being football's greatest enemy still echo in the corridors of power. Rozell's relentless insistence on protecting the game's image remains the blueprint for every commissioner who followed. Even as the business expanded into uncharted territory, those old voices continued to whisper caution. The debt they left behind was not financial, but moral. A debt to honesty, to the promise that football must remain something larger than profit. In the end, the story of gambling and the NFL is not just about corruption or redemption. It is about evolution. It is about how a sport that began in smoke-filled stadiums and handshake deals grew into a corporate empire still haunted by its beginnings. The league's integrity survives not because it is flawless, but because it remembers the cost of forgetting. And so the question lingers, unresolved and eternal. Can a game built on risk ever be truly clean? Perhaps not. But perhaps the point was never purity. Perhaps the real strength of football lies in its willingness to confront its own contradictions. It is a game born from danger, played by men who understand that risk and reward are inseparable. It survives because it reflects the very nature of the country that made it bold, flawed, ambitious, and forever chasing redemption. The debt that remains is not a burden, but a reminder. It tells the league to stay vigilant, to remember the hands that once reached for the envelope under the table, the whispers in the locker room, the fear in the commissioner's office. Those moments built the foundation of the modern NFL. They taught the league that integrity is not a guarantee, but a daily fight, one that never truly ends. As the game moves deeper into the digital age, as odds scroll across screens and millions wager from their phones, the league stands once again at a familiar crossroads. It can embrace progress without forgetting the ghosts that built its walls. The mob's influence may be gone, but its shadow remains, stretching quietly across the 50-yard line, reminding the sport that every gamble, no matter how modern, carries a price. The story of gambling before Vegas was never about crime alone. It was about temptation and consequence, ambition and restraint, loyalty and betrayal. Those themes endure because they are human. They remind us that the battle for integrity never ends, only changes form. The NFL's greatest achievement may not be its championships or its wealth, but its survival, its ability to carry its debts, to face its past, and to keep playing. The story of the league's evolution from those shadowed decades is not simply one of survival, but of transformation. What emerged from the crucible of scandal, rumor, and fear was a game that understood its own fragility. The NFL learned that its greatest asset was not merely athletic excellence or spectacle, but trust. Every hit, every touchdown, every roar of the crowd depended on belief, the belief that the game was honest, that the outcome was earned. That competition itself remained sacred. The league did not reach this realization easily. Its early decades had flirted with chaos. There were moments when the line between sport and scheme blurred, when the whispers of gambling and deceit nearly drowned out the cheers. But from that uncertainty came resolve. What was once a loose confederation of teams became an institution. What was once a game of men trying to survive on muddy fields became an enterprise determined to protect its soul. The scars of that past never truly faded. They became reminders etched into every decision made by the generations that followed. The fear of corruption shaped rules, policies, and the culture that governs every locker room and front office. The men who played after those early decades may not have lived through the scandals, but they inherited the vigilance born from them. Suspicion became a quiet guardian of integrity, a force that still guides the league's conscience even as the world around it changed. The duality of risk defines the league's identity. On the field, players risk their bodies and reputations in pursuit of victory. Off the field, The organization itself risks its legitimacy each time it expands into new ventures or navigates moral gray zones. The NFL's relationship with danger, both physical and ethical, has always mirrored the American spirit: bold, restless, often reckless, yet driven by a desire to prove worth through struggle. It is a league built on contradiction, a celebration of risk that simultaneously fears its consequences. As professional football grew into a cultural monument, the league's leaders understood that the real contest was not between teams, but between faith and doubt. Every controversy, from betting scandals to labor disputes, carried echoes of the 1950s, when one wrong headline could have ended everything. Those years forged a collective instinct to protect the game at all costs. They taught that the image of integrity could never be taken for granted. It had to be guarded with the same ferocity as a fourth-quarter goal line stand. The obsession with purity shaped the league's future policies. Commissioners like Pete Rozelle and Paul Tagliabue were not just administrators. They were stewards of a fragile myth. They inherited an understanding that integrity was not a slogan, but a survival mechanism. Their leadership reflected a truth learned from the past, that trust, once broken, is almost impossible to restore. Each scandal since the suspensions, investigations, and public reckonings has been measured against the ghosts of an earlier time when the entire sport trembled under the weight of suspicion. What emerged from that era was not perfection, but awareness. The NFL learned that to endure, it had to live with contradiction. It had to embrace the spectacle of risk while denying the corruption that risk invited. It had to promote heroism while acknowledging that its heroes were flawed. It had to create order within chaos and sell that order as a promise to millions. The league became not just a sports organization, but a symbol of controlled danger. A reflection of a society that wanted both purity and excitement, discipline and drama. The cost of that transformation was immense. Players who lived through the purges of the 1940s and 1950s saw their reputations destroyed by mere association. Journalists who knew too much were silenced by loyalty or fear. Commissioners bore the burden of moral authority, often sacrificing empathy for control. Yet through that sacrifice, the league carved out something unbreakably moral foundation built on the understanding that integrity must always be louder than temptation. And still, beneath the surface, the same forces that once threatened the league continue to exist in new forms. Sports betting is now legal and heavily commercialized, woven into the very broadcasts that once served as moral battlegrounds. The game that once fought to distance itself from gambling now profits from it. What was once seen as moral decay has become entertainment strategy. The irony is unmistakable. The same temptation that nearly destroyed the league is now one of its most lucrative partnerships. This new era raises the same question that haunted the league's founders. Can a game built on risk ever be truly clean? Integrity in professional sports is not a fixed state, but a constant negotiation. It exists in the tension between competition and corruption, fame and scrutiny, ambition and accountability. The NFL's history is a chronicle of that negotiation, a story of how an institution repeatedly faced the abyss and found ways to pull itself back without losing the public's faith entirely. Perhaps that is the lasting legacy of those early struggles. The NFL's resilience lies not in its ability to avoid danger, but in its capacity to evolve after confronting it. Each scandal, each controversy, became another test of whether the league could separate the game from the forces that sought to control it. The survival of the sport was not inevitable. It was earned through vigilance, reform, and the willingness to learn from its own darkest moments. The league that stands today, polished and global, still carries the weight of that inheritance. Its strict policies, its emphasis on image, its moral posturing all trace back to a time when football's future hung in the balance. Behind the gleaming stadiums and billion-dollar contracts lies the memory of smoke-filled rooms and whispered deals. That memory is the unseen referee, enforcing the rules not of the field but of reputation. The human cost of ambition remains the thread that ties every era together. For the players, the sacrifice is physical and emotional. For the league, it is existential. Every pursuit of greatness risks corruption. Every effort to maintain purity risks hypocrisy. Yet somewhere between those extremes lies the truth of the sport. That integrity is not the absence of temptation, but the strength to resist it. The game survives not because it is perfect, but because it continues to confront its imperfections. The story of football is the story of America itself, balanced between risk and redemption, greed and grace, chaos and control. The league emerged scarred but stronger because it learned to live with those contradictions. It learned that greatness demands both transparency and restraint, both ambition and humility. Its legacy is not one of innocence restored, but of awareness gained. In the end, the question is no longer whether the NFL can be completely clean, but whether it can remain honest about its own complexity. The debt that remains is not financial or moral, but historical, a reminder that the pursuit of integrity is endless. Each new generation inherits not just the victories of the past, but the responsibility to protect what those before them almost lost. Trust, in the world of professional football, is fragile but renewable. It survives through vigilance, through truth, through the quiet acknowledgement that the line between purity and temptation is thinner than any yard marker. The league's true triumph is not in its ability to erase its past, but in its willingness to carry it forward. The scars remain, but they are no longer marks of shame. They are proof that the game endured, that it learned, and that it still matters. The story ends not with absolution, but with understanding. Integrity is never permanent, and neither is corruption. Both live within the same arena, competing for control of the game's soul. The final whistle never truly blows on that contest. It echoes across decades, reminding us that the beauty of football, like the beauty of life itself, lies in the struggle to remain honest in a world built on risk.